Hey there and welcome back. If you are settled now, the day finally behind you and the quiet of the evening drawing close, then good. Because tonight I want to take you somewhere loud and strange and long vanished, into the heart of a vast city in the grip of a kind of fever. A city drowning, quietly and not so quietly, in cheap strong drink. I want to take you into the streets of London in the middle of the 1700s, into the years that later ages would call the gin craze, when the population of the greatest city in the world discovered a spirit so cheap and so strong that they could drink themselves out of their harsh lives for the price of a scrap of bread, and did in their thousands until the city itself seemed to reel. It is a hard world we are going into, and a vivid one, full of noise and smell and colour, and I will keep its sharper edges gentle for you, but I want you to feel it, the warmth and the squalor and the strange, terrible comfort of it. Come with me, then, back into the gin-soaked streets of Georgian London. And on a corner of one of those streets, behind a low door, there waits a woman who sells a drink so cheap that the sign above her counter makes a promise no honest seller should ever make, and we will stand before that sign, in time, and read it. It is a world that has passed so completely that we can scarcely imagine it now. A London without clean water or safe streets or any genuine help for the destitute. A place where life was cheap and gin was cheaper, and yet the poor who lived in it were not so different from us, wanting only warmth and rest and a little ease at the end of a brutal day, and finding it where they could. If wandering through these vanished places is something you find you would like to do again, you are always welcome to subscribe, and to keep me company the next time we step together into some lost corner of the past. There is no hurry about any of it. The whole of tonight is simply for us to spend a few unhurried hours inside this strange, loud world, to let it grow real around us, to walk its streets and learn its trade and understand, as its people understood, what it was to be poor and cold and human in the great city of London in the world of gin. So picture this. It is evening, somewhere in the poorer reaches of London, in the parish of Saint Giles, perhaps, the most notorious of all the gin districts, and the light is failing over a maze of narrow streets and crowded courts and leaning houses. The air is thick, close, full of smells, the smoke of 10,000 coal fires hanging low over the rooftops, the reek of the open drains running down the centres of the streets, the stink of too many people living too close together with nowhere for their waste to go. It is loud, even now as the day fades, the cries of the street sellers and the rattle of cartwheels on the broken cobbles and the voices of the crowd, and through it all, from every few doors it seems, comes the warm yellow glow and the noise and the sweetish reek of the dram-shops, the little gin sellers that stand on every corner of this drowning parish. Come with me down into it, into the narrow streets as the dark gathers, and let us see what it was really like to walk through London in the world of gin. Let us begin with the smell, because the smell of this London is the first thing of all that would strike you before you had seen anything at all, the thing that no one who walked these streets ever forgot. It is an overwhelming smell, layered and thick and inescapable, and it is not, for the most part, a pleasant one, though we will find sweetness in it too. There is the coal smoke above everything, the great pall of it that hangs over the whole city, caught in the throat, stinging the eyes, the smoke of the countless small fires by which the population cooked and warmed themselves, settling down over the streets in the still evening air. There is the smell of the streets themselves, the open kennels running with the filth of the houses, the refuse thrown down and trodden into the mud, the absence of any drains or sewers worth the name, so that the very ground underfoot reeks of the waste of the crowded living. There is the smell of ordinary folk, the unwashed bodies pressed close in the narrow ways, for water was scarce and washing a luxury, and a whole population lived and laboured in the same clothes through the seasons. And threaded through all of it, from the open doors of the dram-shops, there is the smell of the gin, and it is a strange smell, sharp and sweetish at once. The harsh bite of the raw spirit, softened by the juniper and the other flavourings. A smell that promised warmth, and forgetting to people who had little of either. It drifted out into the reeking streets from every gin shop, mingling with the coal smoke and the filth and the press of bodies, and to the city's poor who walked these streets, it was the smell of the one cheap comfort within their reach, the smell of escape, and it must have pulled at them as they passed, cold and tired and low, the warm, sweet reek of the gin, promising an hour of ease for a coin or two. The smell of this London was the smell of poverty and crowding and hard labour, the coal and the filth and the press of the needy, and woven all through it, on every corner, the sweetish bite of the cheap gin that the complete drowning parish reached for, and once you have it in your nose you cannot lose it, the unmistakable smell of London in the age of the gin craze. Come closer now, to one of those low doors with its warm yellow glow, and let us step inside into one of the dram-shops, the little gin cellars that were the heart of the whole craze. For there were thousands of them across the city, and to understand the age you must stand inside one. It is a small room, low-ceilinged, crowded, lit by a tallow candle or two, and the glow of a meagre fire, and the warmth of it after the cold street is the first thing you feel, the press of bodies and the heat of the fire and the candle, a refuge from the dark and the chill outside. The air is thick with the smell of the spirit and the smoke and the close-packed people, and loud with their voices, for this is a place of company, as much as of drink, a warm-lit room where the poor of the parish gather at the end of the day to find each other and the gin together. The people in the room are not, for the most part, the ruined wretches of the cautionary prince, though there are some far gone among them. They are ordinary working people, the labourers and the porters and the washerwomen and the street sellers of the parish, come in out of the cold for the cheap warmth and the cheap forgetting at the end of a day of hard and ill-paid toil. They stand at the rough counter, or sit on what seats there are, and they drink their drams and they talk, and there is a kind of warmth in it, a human warmth of company and shelter, that we should not pretend away in our hurry to see only the harm. For an hour, in the warm-lit room, with the gin easing through them and their neighbours about them, the cold and the hunger and the hopelessness of their lives drew back a little, and that easing was true, whatever it cost them after. Behind a counter stands the seller, and very often the seller is a woman, for the gin trade was a trade that women could enter, needing little money and no guild and no great strength, only a room and a barrel and a measure, and many a poor woman kept herself and her family by selling gin from her front room. She draws the spirit from the barrel and measures it into the cups, the small cheap measures that the poor could afford, a dram for a coin, and she takes the coins and passes back the gin, the total simple endless transaction by which the city drank. The dram shop was the smallest unit of the wide trade, the point where the gin reached the people at last, the warm-lit room on the corner where the wretched came in from the cold to buy their pennyworth of ease, and it was repeated, that little room and that simple exchange on every corner of every poor street in the city, thousands upon thousands of times, until the whole of London seemed to have become one great gin shop, glowing warm and reeking sweet on every corner of the drowning streets. But how did it come to this? How did the poor of London come to be drowning in cheap gin? And to find the answer, we must leave these streets for a while, and cross the cold grey sea to the country where the drink was born, to the flat, water-laced, prosperous provinces of the Low Countries, the land we now call the Netherlands. Gin is not an English drink at all in its origin. It came from the Dutch, who had been making it for generations before it ever reached England, and they called it Geneva, a clear, strong spirit distilled from grain and flavoured with the juniper berry from which its name descended. The Dutch had built around it an orderly and a prosperous trade, for theirs was the most advanced commercial society in Europe in those years, a republic of merchants and sailors grown rich on the carrying trade of the world, and Geneva was one of their national pleasures, made with care and drunk with relish in the crowded, prosperous towns of the Dutch Golden Age. The drink had begun, as so many strong drinks began, as a medicine. The juniper berry was credited by the physicians of the Low Countries with real healing virtues, good for the stomach and the kidneys, and against the damps and agues of that low wet land. And the apothecaries had taken to distilling the juniper into a spirit to preserve and concentrate its virtues, so that the earliest Geneva was sold not in taverns, but in the shops of the apothecaries, a medicine taken by the spoonful for what ailed you. But the pleasant medicine with an agreeable effect upon the spirits does not stay long upon the apothecary's shelf, and Geneva made the short journey from the medicine chest to the tavern counter, becoming, by stages, a popular drink, the national spirit of the Dutch, made in immense quantity by dedicated distillers and drunk across the land. And the Dutch wrought it well, in their careful, meticulous fashion. They began with a base of malted grain, a mixture of barley and rye fermented and distilled into what they called malt wine, a grain spirit with an actual body and flavour of its own, and this they redistilled with the juniper and the other botanicals, drawing the flavours into the spirit, so that the finished Geneva tasted of its grain and its juniper, both full and complex, and worth the savouring. They drank it cold, in small glasses filled to the very brim, taken in a single practised swallow, in their homes and their taverns, a polished product of a polished and prosperous society. This was the drink, careful and respectable and well made, that would cross the sea to England and there, under very different pressures, become something altogether cruder and cheaper and more terrible, the raw, fierce gin of the London dram-shops. But in its origin it was this, the Dutch Geneva, the careful national spirit of the merchant republic, and that is where the long road to Gin Lane begins. The drink crossed to England in the train of a king, and the king was a Dutchman, and the story of how he came to wear the English crown is worth the telling, for it set the entire flood in motion. In the autumn of the year 1688, a Dutch prince named William of Orange landed on the coast of England with an army at his back, come to take the throne of his father-in-law, the Catholic King James II, whose rule had so alarmed his Protestant subjects that they had looked abroad for a deliverer and found one in William. He was a small, reserved, asthmatic man, no glow in him for crowds, a soldier and a statesman to the bone, and his whole life was governed by one great purpose, the containment of the power of France and its mighty king, and he wanted England's wealth and England's fleet for that long struggle. The regime of King James collapsed before him almost without a blow, and William and his wife Mary came to the throne together, in the bloodless overturning that its beneficiaries would call the Glorious Revolution. He brought his Dutchness with him, this new king, his Dutch court and his Dutch soldiers and his Dutch tastes, and among those tastes was the juniper spirit of his homeland. What had been an exotic foreign curiosity became, almost overnight, the fashionable drink of the new establishment. Geneva sipped in imitation of the Dutch king and his courtiers, and the soldiers who had come over with William, garrisoned now in English towns, drank their accustomed spirit, and spread the taste for it among their English comrades, and the labouring poor about them. The English took up the drink of their new rulers as people do, and the foreign name shortened on English tongues, Geneva becoming Geneva, and then, more roughly still, the single curt syllable gin, and in that quick contraction of the name you can hear the drink becoming English, becoming common, becoming the thing it would soon be. But fashion alone would never have produced the flood. What turned a fashionable import into a cheap domestic deluge was the deliberate policy of the English state, and it flowed from the same events that had brought William to the throne. For William's reign meant war with France, a long and costly war that would run on for a generation and more, and a country at war with France did not wish to drink French brandy and send good money across the sea to its enemy. The government wanted its people to drink something English instead, made from English grain, and so it threw open the trade in homemade spirits, breaking the old monopoly that had kept distilling a small and contained business, and declaring that anyone who wished might distill and sell spirits made from English corn. It was meant to help the farmers and to hurt the French and to fill the treasury, and it did all three, but it did something else as well, something no one intended, for it opened the door to a flood of cheap raw gin that would, within a generation, be drowning the labouring poor of London in the streets. Let us turn now to the making of the gin itself, to what was actually in the cup, for the cheapness and the harshness of the London gin both flowed from how it was made, and the difference between it and the careful Dutch Geneva was the difference between a craft and a flood. Gin begins, like all distilled spirits, with grain, with the cheap surplus grain of the English harvests that the good years had piled up in such abundance that its price had fallen low. The grain was mashed and fermented into a kind of crude beer, a wash, and then it was distilled, heated so that the spirit rose as a vapour, and was caught and cooled back into a liquid far stronger than the wash it came from. That much was the same everywhere, in the Dutch distillery and the London still alike. The difference lay in the care. The Dutch made their malt wine slowly and well, with good grain and attentive distillation, building flavour into the base. The London gin was produced fast and cheap and careless, for a market that wanted strength and oblivion at the lowest possible price and cared nothing for refinement. It was distilled grim and quick to strip out a high-strength, near-tasteless raw spirit as fast as could be done, and onto that fierce raw base was thrown a minimum of flavouring, a coarse dose of juniper, or in the worst of it, not even that but a cheap substitute, oil of turpentine even, which shared something of the piney note of the juniper and cost far less than the real berries. The point was never flavour. The point was strength and price, the most intoxication for the fewest pennies, and the flavouring existed only to make the raw spirit barely possible to swallow. And worse than the carelessness was the adulteration, the doctoring of the cheapest gin with substances added to fake its strength, or to stretch its quantity, or to disguise how poorly it was made. There were sellers who added sulphuric acid to give the spirit a false fierce bite, or other harsh and sometimes poisonous substances to fortify the cheap thin gin, so that the people of London, paying a penny for oblivion, very often had no idea what was actually in the cup, and the answer, in the worst cases, was a brew of raw grain spirit, a gesture of juniper or turpentine, and whatever cheap adulterant the seller had found to swell his profit. It did genuine and lasting harm to the bodies of those who drank it in such quantity, this crude adulterated fire, and it was a world away from the careful savoured Geneva of the Dutch from which it had so sadly descended. The cheapness that drew the poor and the harshness that harmed them were the same thing, the two faces of a spirit made down to the lowest possible price for the most desperate possible market. Now let us try to take in the sheer scale of the drinking, for it is the thing that makes the gin craze what it was, and the figures are of a kind that the mind slides off, so that we must slow down to feel their weight. In the worst of the years, the people of London were drinking something on the order of 10 or 11 million gallons of gin a year, in a city of perhaps 700,000 souls. Set the one number against the other, and you arrive at a figure that seems scarcely possible, on the order of 14 gallons of raw spirit a year for every man, woman and child in the capital, the infants and the elderly and the abstaining all included in the count. Let us make that real, because a gallon is an abstraction and the body is not. 14 gallons a year is more than a pint of gin a week for every living person in London, which means that the actual drinkers, the labouring men and women at the heart of the trade, were drinking very much more than that, several pints a week, in some cases a pint or more in a single day. And this was no mild modern measure, cut with water and sipped through an evening, but a raw, fierce, high-strength spirit knocked back in drams for its effect. To drink a pint of such a spirit across a day, day after day, is to live in a more or less perpetual state of intoxication, and that, for a great number of the London poor in these years, is precisely what the figures describe, a population a large part of which was, much of the time, simply drunk. It is the scale that distinguishes the gin craze from the ordinary drunkenness that has walked beside human beings in every age. There have always been drunkards in each time and place. There had never before been a great city in which the average draught of raw spirit ran to more than a pint a week for each soul, in which gin was cheaper than beer and more freely to be had than clean water, in which a person might drink themselves insensible for the price of a mouthful of bread. The figure of 14 gallons a head is the full crisis pressed into a single number, and when you hold it properly in your mind and feel what it would mean for a city to drink like that, you understand why the labouring sort who lived through it believed, with true reason, that they were watching their capital drown in gin before their eyes. We have stood inside a dram-shop already, but let us go back into the trade itself, into the strange and varied ways that the gin reached the people, for it was sold not only in the little shops but everywhere, in 1,000 forms, by a multitude of hands. The cheapness and the ease of the trade meant that almost anyone could enter it, needing only a small store of spirit and something to measure it with, and so the selling of gin spread through the poor districts like water through cracked ground, into every kind of premises and no premises at all. It was sold in the proper dram-shops with their counters and their barrels. It was sold in the back rooms of ordinary houses, by the lowest sort to the poor. It was sold from barrows and from baskets in the streets, by hawkers carrying it through the crowds. It was sold, it was said, in the very prisons, and in the workhouses, and wherever the destitute were gathered there was someone near at hand to sell them gin. There were sellers who could not afford even a room, who carried the spirit through the streets in a barrow, or hawked it from house to house, and there were the most ingenious devices for selling it, where selling it was forbidden, the cleverest of which became a kind of legend of the age. There was a contrivance, set up by a sharp-witted seller, by which a passer-by could buy gin from a machine in the wall, without ever seeing the seller at all, putting a coin into the mouth of a carved wooden cat fixed to the wall of a house, and receiving, through a hidden pipe, a measure of gin poured out by the hidden seller within. The buyer would call out to the cat, asking for the gin, and lay the coin in its paw, and the spirit would flow out through the pipe into the cup or the mouth held beneath it. The whole transaction conducted through the wall with the wooden cat between buyer and seller, so that neither need see the other nor any informer prove the sale. Such tricks and devices speak of how deep the trade ran, and how determined the common people were to have their gin, for these contrivances grew up in answer to the law's attempts to check the selling, the trade always finding a new way round each obstacle the law put up. The gin reached working folk through every channel that ingenuity could devise, the proper shops and the back rooms and the barrows and the baskets and the cats in the wall, a vast dispersed multitude of sellers, huge and small, pouring the cheap spirit out to a vast thirsty population, and it was the smallness and the cheapness and the sheer everywhere-ness of it, the gin to be had on every corner and through every wall for the smallest of coins, that made the great flood possible, the whole city threaded through and through with the selling of gin, until it seemed there was no street and no door where it could not be had. Let us return to the streets, And let us look at them as one man looked at them. For there was an artist living in London in those years who fixed the gin craze in a single image so powerfully that we see it, even now, very largely through his eyes. He was a painter and engraver, sharp-eyed and moralizing and fiercely English, and in the year 1751 he made an engraving that he called Gin Lane, and into that one crowded sheet of paper he poured the whole horror of the trade as he saw it. The scene is a London street, the very kind of street we have been walking through, identified by its details as the gin-soaked parish of Saint Giles, and it is falling into ruin before our eyes, the buildings cracking and tumbling, the city's people sprawled and wasted, the total place collapsing under the weight of the drink. At the very centre of the image, where the eye is drawn at once, sits a woman on a flight of steps, sunk in a gin stupor, oblivious, and from her slack arms her infant child is slipping, tumbling head first over the railing toward the cellar below, its small arms flung out, its fall unseen by the mother the gin has carried past all-knowing. It is one of the most disturbing images in all of English art, and it was meant to be, made to seize the viewer and not let go, the drunken mother and the falling child, the unforgettable heart of the whole terrible scene. Around them the street tells the same story in a dozen smaller horrors. The wasted man slumped on the steps, the buildings collapsing, the one prosperous business in the entire ruined scene, the pawnbrokers, where the desperate bring the last of their goods to sell for the price of another drink. Made a companion to it, this artist, and printed the two together, for the opposite of Gin Lane was a second image he called Beer Street, and the contrast between them was his entire argument made visible. A Gin Lane is a vision of hell, Beer Street is a vision of health, its people plump and ruddy and well-fed, its buildings sound and freshly painted, its citizens at honest work and honest rest, drinking the good wholesome English beer that the artist, like many of his countrymen, held to be the proper drink of a free and industrious people. Beer, in his argument, was English and healthful and the drink of work. Gin was foreign and ruinous, and the drink of death. Set the two side by side as they were meant to be seen, and the message needs no words, and it has lasted 2.5 centuries, so that when we picture the gin craze at all, we picture it, almost always, exactly as that sharp-eyed London artist taught us to. I want to take you back from the artist's image to the human truth beneath it, to the dram-shop on a winter evening and the ordinary people who filled it, because the figure of the falling child is the extreme and the warning, and the daily reality was something quieter and sadder and more human. Stand again in the low warm room, among the labourers and the washerwomen, and the porters come in from the cold, and understand what the gin was to them, plainly and without either the moralising of the reformers or any false romance. It was cheap, and it was warming, and it was above all a swift and certain escape from lives that were, for very many of the people who drank it, almost beyond bearing. They lived in cold and crowded rooms, worked when they could find work at exhausting and ill-paid labour, ate poorly, fell sick without remedy, and watched their children die in numbers we can scarcely imagine. Against all that, the gin offered the one cheap pleasure within their reach, the one thing that could, for the price of a coin or two, lift them out of the cold and the hunger and the hopelessness for an hour. It is no mystery at all why they drank it, and drank it to excess, and would not be argued or frightened or legislated out of drinking it. The wonder, when you understand the lives, is not that they drank so much, but that anyone expected them to drink less. The reformers, for all their genuine concern and their real evidence of actual harm, never quite grasped this, that the gin was a symptom far more than it was the disease, that the true affliction was the poverty and the hardness of the lives, and the gin only the desperate answer to it. This is the thing to hold on to as we walk these streets, that the poor drinking themselves insensible in the dram-shops were not wicked or weak in some way that we are not, but poor and cold and tired, beyond our understanding, reaching, as people in pain have always reached, for whatever ease was cheap enough to afford. When the conditions of their lives began, very slowly and very partially, to improve in the later part of the century, and when the gin grew dearer, the drinking eased, not because the multitude had been reformed, but because the pressures that drove them to the bottle had begun, a little, to lift. The story of the gin craze, read rightly, is a story about poverty, about what human beings will reach for when their lives are hard enough and the escape is cheap enough. And that is a truth that did not end in the 1750s and has not ended yet. It would be dishonest to walk these streets and speak only of the warmth and the ease, for the drinking did real harm, and a part of that harm was a rise in crime and disorder that frightened the city, and I want to speak of it plainly, but with care, for the human reality beneath the word crime was, very often, simple desperation. A great deal of the offending was petty, the small thefts of people who had drunk away the means of buying what they needed, the pawning of goods that were not the drinkers to pawn, the little dishonesties of the destitute. There was public disorder, the drunkenness that spilled into the streets, the quarrels and the scuffles that strong drink has always bred, the population found insensible in the doorways and the gutters of a morning. The magistrates who sat in judgment saw the same pattern again and again, the offence committed by a person whose life the gin had already half undone. There were graver matters too, and I will name them with the restraint they deserve. There was violence, the brawls and the assaults that flared among people, made reckless and quarrelsome by drink. There were cases of terrible neglect, of children left untended or harmed by parents lost to the bottle, the kind of sorrow that the artist placed at the very centre of his print because it horrified the age as nothing else could. And there were, in the records, a small number of genuinely dreadful crimes, acts done by people in the grip of a craving that had overwhelmed every natural restraint, cases the reformers seized upon as the ultimate proof of what gin could do to a soul. These were real, and they were terrible, and they were also, mercifully, rare, the extreme and shocking exceptions rather than the ordinary run of the trouble. What I want you to hold on to is that the crime was a branch of the same desperation that drove the drinking, and not a separate wickedness in the people who drank. These were not, for the most part, criminals who happened to drink gin. They were poor and desperate people whom gin and poverty together drove, sometimes to acts they would not otherwise have done, and the offending rose and fell with the drinking, and the drinking rose and fell with the poverty and the price of the spirit. When the trade was brought under control, and the gin grew dearer, the crime the reformers had blamed upon it eased along with the drinking, which is the clearest sign that the gin and the crime and the misery were all branches of a single root, and that root was the condition of the London poor. The crimes were genuine, and the suffering they caused was real, but they are understood rightly only as part of the larger tragedy, the response of desperate people to lives made unbearable, and not as the simple villainy the harshest moralists made of them. There is one figure in the gin districts who drew more horror and more comment than any other, and it is worth understanding why, for it tells us as much about the fears of the age as about the trade, and that is the gin-drinking woman. Of all the images the reformers and the moralists returned to, none had more power than the mother destroyed by gin, the woman who drank instead of tending her children, whose drinking seemed to strike at the very foundation of the family, and so of society itself. It was no accident that the artist placed a drunken mother and her falling child at the very centre of his image, for he knew exactly which figure would horrify his age most deeply, and it was this one. The fear had a basis in a true change, for women did indeed drink gin and sell it, to a degree that older kinds of drinking had not involved them in. The old drinking world of the alehouse had been largely a world of men, But the gin trade, sold in small rooms and back premises, conducted often by women and bought freely by them, drew women into both the selling and the drinking of spirits, in numbers that were new and that alarmed the respectable deeply. A drunken man was a familiar disorder. A drunken mother seemed to the moralists something closer to the unravelling of the natural order itself, a sign that the very foundations were dissolving, the woman on whom the whole edifice of the household was felt to rest, brought low by the cheap spirit. We should hold two matters together here, looking back and not let go of either. There was real suffering, actual harm, real neglect, and it fell hard on children, and that was a genuine tragedy and not to be waved away. And there was, woven through the horror, a panic about women that ran well beyond the facts of the trade, a fear of women stepping out of their appointed place, drinking and selling and gathering in the dram-shops as men did, that gave the outcry about the gin-drinking woman a force out of all proportion, so that she became the very emblem of the full crisis. Both things are true. The harm was genuine, and the panic was real, and the figure of the ruined woman carried a freight of social fear that the facts alone do not explain, and the history is only understood when we hold the suffering and the fear together and mistake neither for the whole. As the harm grew and the city reeled, there rose up a body of men determined to do something about the gin, the reformers, and it is worth knowing them, for they were not idle moralists, but men who had seen the effects of the trade at close quarters, and set themselves to gather the evidence and make the case that would move Parliament at last. The most important of them for our story was a magistrate who sat in judgment over a great part of London, a novelist as well as a justice, who conducted his business from a chamber in Bow Street, and who saw the gin trade from the bench, in the endless procession of the drunk and the destitute and the violent and the desperate who came before him day after day. He came to regard the cheap spirit as the single greatest cause of the crime and misery he confronted, and he set down his case in a long and closely argued pamphlet, an inquiry into the causes of the rise in robbery and crime, in which he laid a great part of the blame squarely upon gin. He described, with the authority of a man who had questioned thousands of the London poor across his bench, the way the cheap spirit dissolved the bonds of work and family and law, the way a population drunk on gin became incapable of honest labour and ripe for crime, the way the trade fed upon and worsened the very poverty from which it sprang. He was not the only voice. There were physicians who testified to what the gin did to the body, the College of Physicians itself petitioning against the harm the trade was doing to the health of the city's poor. There were the writers and the clergymen and the men of business who had been arguing against the trade for years. And there was the artist with his terrible image, the print of Gin Lane appearing in the very same year, the magistrate's careful argument and the artist's unforgettable picture striking at the public conscience together, from different directions at the same decisive moment. Daaraan toast me as instrument on Pete. And want. For the campaign was reaching, by the middle of the century, a point of true force, gathering decades of argument and evidence into a pressure that the Parliament could no longer easily resist. The reformers had grown wiser across those decades, learning both what the trade actually was and what could and could not be done about it, and their wisdom, joined to the artist's image and the magistrate's evidence and other forces we will come to, was turning the tide at last. They were right about the harm, these reformers, even where they were wrong about its cause, for they tended to see the gin as the disease itself, rather than the symptom of the deeper affliction of poverty. But they had seen the suffering clearly, and they were determined to end it, and their long campaign was, in the end, a part of what brought the great flood of gin under control. The Parliament had been trying to check the gin for a long time before it finally succeeded, and the story of its failures is one of the most instructive parts of the complete history, so let us follow it. The first serious attempt came in the year 1736, with an act so severe that it amounted to an attempt at outright prohibition. Rather than tax the gin moderately or regulate its sale sensibly, the act set out to suppress the retail trade almost entirely by laying upon anyone who wished to sell gin a licence fee of £50 a year, a sum so enormous, so far beyond the means of the small dram sellers who made up the bulk of the trade, that it meant in effect that the lawful selling of gin would simply cease. The intention was to price the trade out of existence at a stroke. The result was nothing of the kind. For the Act of 1736 did not end the gin trade. It drove it underground. The dram sellers did not pay the impossible fee and closed their doors. They went on selling gin without a licence, in defiance of a law that was almost impossible to enforce against so vast and so dispersed a trade, selling it under counters and behind curtains and through the wall, under invented names, by every shift and device the ingenuity of the age could contrive. The chief visible effect of the Act was to create a new and hated trade in informing, for the law offered rewards to those who would report the illegal sellers, and a class of professional informers sprang up to collect the bounties, loathed by the common throng among whom they worked, mobbed and beaten in the streets when they were discovered, and sometimes worse. The popular hatred of the Act ran so deep that its passing was met with something close to mourning, the labouring poor staging mock funerals in the streets for Madame Geneva, as they had come to call the gin, processing with a kind of bitter festival grief for the death of their cheap comfort, killed, as they saw it, by the cruelty of a distant parliament that did not understand their lives. And the law failed in the simplest way of all, for the drinking did not fall. By every measure the authorities could devise, the gin-drinking of London went on at very nearly the same extraordinary level after the Act as before it, the trade having merely changed its form from a lawful one to an unlawful one without changing its scale. Within a few years the government was forced to admit that the wide experiment in prohibition had failed completely, and in the year 1743 it passed a new Act that abandoned the whole approach, setting the licence fee low and the duty moderate, bringing the trade back above ground, choosing to licence and tax and watch the gin rather than to forbid it. It was a confession that prohibition could not be made to work, and a decision to manage the trade instead of trying to destroy it. What then finally worked if prohibition had failed so completely? The answer came in the year 1751, the same year as the artist's terrible print, with another Act of Parliament, and it succeeded precisely because it did not attempt what the Act of 1736 had attempted. It did not try to abolish the trade. It tried instead to tame it, and the difference between those two aims turned out to be the difference between failure and success. The Act of 1751 raised the duties on gin moderately, enough to push the price up somewhat, but not so high as to drive the trade back into the shadows. It restricted the selling to licensed premises of a respectable kind, and forbade the distillers from selling gin directly to the public, and stopped the sale of gin in prisons and workhouses, and took a series of measured practical steps to bring the trade under proper control rather than to crush it. It worked with the grain of the situation rather than against it, accepting that gin would be sold and drunk while making its sale more orderly, more accountable, more costly, and less universal. The dram-shop on every corner, the gin sold from barrows and behind curtains and through the wall, began to give way to a more regulated trade in proper licensed houses, and the price crept up, and the easy universal availability that had defined the worst years began, slowly, to recede. It was not a sudden thing, no single stroke that ended the craze overnight, but a steady tightening, a bringing of the trade under control, and it pointed the way that the management of such things would go ever after, the licensing and the taxing and the regulating that we still know. But the Act of 1751 was not by itself the whole story of the ending, and it would be a mistake to imagine that one law simply switched off a phenomenon that had raged for 30 years. Other forces were moving in the same direction at the same time, and chief among them was the price of bread, the price of grain itself. We will come to that, for it was perhaps the most powerful force of all, the quiet economic engine that did as much as any law to end the craze. The law had found, at last, the right approach, the taming rather than the forbidding, the working with the trade rather than against it, and it deserves its place as the measure that turned the tide. But it turned the tide with the help of deeper currents, and to understand the ending fully we must follow those currents too, down to the fields where the grain grew and the price that the grain commanded. For there, as much as in any Act of Parliament, lay the real engine of the ending. So let us follow the grain, for the cheap gin had rested all along upon cheap grain, and when the grain ceased to be cheap, the gin ceased to be cheap with it. And that, more quietly and more powerfully than any law, helped to bring the great flood down. Remember how the craze had begun, in part with a glut of grain, the good harvests of the early decades piling up corn in such abundance that its price fell low, and the landed men who governed the country, whose wealth came from the land, looking about for some way to use the surplus and prop up the price, and finding it in the distilleries, which would consume immense quantities of grain to make their spirit. The cheap gin and the cheap grain were bound together from the start, the one made possible by the other, and the interests of the distillers and the interests of the landowners in Parliament had run together in favour of the trade. But around the middle of the century the long run of good harvests broke. A series of poorer years drove the price of grain steeply up, and dearer grain meant dearer gin, for the spirit was made from the grain, and could be no cheaper than its raw material. The penny that had once bought oblivion now bought only a mouthful, and the great advantage that gin had held over every other consolation, its unbeatable cheapness, began to slip away. And as the price rose, the drinking fell in the simple, brutal arithmetic of poverty, for people who had drunk gin because it was the cheapest thing within reach drank less of it when it ceased to be cheap, not because they had been reformed or frightened, but because they could no longer afford to drown themselves. There was more to it than the harvests, for the landed men who had once wanted the gin trade to soak up their surplus grain no longer needed it when the surplus was gone and the grain dear again, and so the quiet weight of the powerful in favour of cheap gin, which had so long resisted reform, at last lifted. The poor of London, in a bitter irony, got their relief in part because the men who governed them no longer had a financial reason to keep them drunk. Law and economics worked together in the end, the Act of 1751 making the trade more controlled, and the rising price of grain making the spirit more dear, and between them the conditions that had produced the gin craze quietly dissolved. It was not a heroic ending, no triumph of virtue over vice, but it was the true one, and it carries its own hard lesson that the surest way to change what desperate people do is, very often, simply to change what it costs them to do it. Let us go back for a while to what was actually in the cup, to the flavourings of the gin, for the spirit is defined above all by the juniper and its companions, and the story of those flavourings reaches from the hedgerows of Europe to the trading ports of the wider age. At the heart of gin, the one thing without which it is not gin at all, sits the juniper berry, which is not truly a berry but the small dark fleshy cone of a hardy evergreen shrub that grows wild across the cooler regions of the northern world, on heaths and hillsides, and in the poor stony soils where little else will thrive. The ripe cones are a deep blue-black, dusted with a pale bloom, and they carry within them the sharp, resinous, faintly piney scent that is the defining smell and taste of gin, the note that announces the spirit the moment the cup is raised. The juniper gives gin its whole character, and a spirit flavoured with anything else, however pleasant, is something other than gin. But juniper alone does not make a fine gin, and the better distillers used an entire company of supporting flavourings, the botanicals as they were called, each lending its own note. There was coriander seed, warm and slightly citrus and faintly spicy, rounding the sharpness of the juniper. There was angelica root, earthy and dry and woody, binding the other flavours and holding them in the spirit. There was orris root, the dried root of the iris, a fixative that held the volatile perfumes and lent a soft floral undertone. There were dried citrus peels for brightness, and caraway and cardamom and cassia and licorice, and a dozen other seeds and roots and barks and peels, each house guarding its own recipe, the precise blend that gave its gin its character. And here is a thing worth pausing on, for it tells us much about the age. Many of these flavourings were not native to Europe at all, but came from the far ends of the earth, carried back along the great trade routes that the Dutch and then the English were opening across the world in exactly these years. The coriander and the cardamom, the cassia and the citrus, arrived in the ports of Amsterdam and London in the holds of the ships that were making the merchant nations rich, part of the same vast commerce in spices and exotic goods that was remaking the world. Gin, in this sense, was a child of the age of global trade, a drink that gathered into a single cup the juniper of the European heath and the spices of the distant Indies. And the strange truth that a poor Londoner could drink a spirit flavoured with the produce of the other side of the world is a quiet measure of how far and how deep the trading networks of the 18th century had already reached. But that was the fine gin, the careful gin. The cheap gin of the dram-shops, as we have seen, made do with the barest gesture of juniper or with turpentine in its place, and reached the needy stripped of all that richness, a raw fierce spirit with a token note of the berry, made down to a price. Let us cross the sea once more, back to the Dutch and their careful spirit, to see what they had made of the same drink that drowned the London poor. For the contrast is one of the deepest lessons of the whole history. The heart of the Dutch trade was a town near Rotterdam called Schiedam, which grew across the 17th and 18th centuries into the beating capital of the Geneva industry, a place so given over to distilling that its skyline came to be dominated by the enormous windmills built to grind the grain for the stills, and its air, by every account, hung heavy with the smell of fermenting mash and distilling spirit. Schiedam was to Geneva what later towns would be to other industries, a place of concentration and skill, where the distillers gathered in their hundreds, and the supporting trades of malting and barrel-making grew up around them, and the craft of fine distilling was refined and handed on. It was a real industry, organised and prosperous and proud of its product, and the Geneva of Schiedam was exported across Europe and beyond as a quality good, a respected article of Dutch commerce alongside the cheeses and the textiles and the painted tiles. Hold that beside what England made of the same drink, and the contrast tells the whole story. The Dutch built around their spirit an orderly, skilled, quality-conscious industry, producing a refined product for a discerning market, and drinking it, on the whole, in moderation. The English, taking the very same spirit, produced instead a flood of cheap, rough gin from countless small, unregulated stills, made down to a price for the people market imaginable, and let it run riot through their capital, and reaped a catastrophe. The same drink, in two different societies, became two entirely different affairs, a polished export in the one and a social disaster in the other. And the difference lay not in the spirit itself, but in how each society chose to make and sell and govern it, which is perhaps the deepest truth the whole story has to teach. Gin was not, in itself, a poison or a blessing. It was a drink, a strong spirit flavoured with juniper, capable of being fashioned well or badly, drunk wisely or to ruin, sold in an orderly trade or a chaotic one. The Dutch turned out it carefully and drank it in measure, and built a respected industry around it. The English, under the particular pressures of cheap grain and wartime policy and crushing urban poverty, wrought it carelessly and cheaply, and let it loose upon a desperate people, and reaped the whirlwind. The harm a thing does, the story seems to say, depends far less on the thing itself than on the conditions, the laws, the prices, and the human needs into which it is released. And the same juniper spirit that was a Dutch pleasure became, across the narrow sea, an English ruin. There is a phrase that has come down to us from these years, worn so smooth by long use that we no longer hear its origin, and it carries the whole Dutch connection inside it, the phrase Dutch courage. It comes from the battlefields and the warships where Englishmen and Dutchmen fought, and where the English first saw the Dutch soldier's habit of taking a measure of Geneva before going into action. The spirit, it was observed, steadied the nerves and warmed the blood, and lent a man a certain reckless boldness in the face of danger, and the English, watching their Dutch comrades fortify themselves so before a fight, gave the practice its lasting name, the courage that came not from the heart, but from the bottle. Dutch courage, the borrowed bravery of a swallow of gin. Whether the phrase truly began on the battlefield or was simply fixed to the drink afterward hardly matters, for the thing it names was actual enough, and it points to one of the genuine attractions of the spirit, the swift chemical courage it could lend to a frightened or a despairing person. The soldier before the charge, the sailor before the storm, and later the labourer before the cold grey misery of another London day, all reached for the same thing, the warmth and the boldness and the brief lifting of fear, that a strong drink taken quickly could give. There is no great mystery in it. The gin worked in the narrow and temporary way that it worked, and the courage it lent, borrowed and brief and paid back with interest in the grey hours afterward, was a real effect that genuine people sought for real reasons, and the Dutch connection ran deeper than a phrase, for it was bound up with the total long entanglement of England and the Low Countries of rivalry turning to alliance. The two nations had fought a series of bitter naval wars against each other in the 17th century, trade rivals contesting the carrying trade of the world, and then, with the coming of the Dutch William to the English throne, they had become close allies against the common enemy of France. Dutch soldiers garrisoned in England, Dutch merchants trading in London, Dutch fashions and Dutch tastes flowing across the narrow sea in the train of a Dutch king, all of this carried the Geneva into England along the channels of a deep and complicated relationship between the two peoples, so that the gin that would ruin so many London lives arrived not as some exotic stranger, but as one more thread in the close weave that bound England to the Dutch Republic across the water. And as come back into the dram shop one more time, and let us watch the drinking itself, the small rituals of the cup and the swallow, for there is a whole texture of daily life in it that the huge figures and the Acts of Parliament never capture. The gin was sold, as the very word dram suggests, by the small measure, a mouthful or two, the quantity a poor person could afford for a coin. It was not, for the most part, drunk slowly, or savoured in the careful Dutch way from a brimming glass. It was knocked back quickly, a swift, harsh swallow of the raw spirit, taken standing at the counter or carried away in a cup, the object being not the lingering pleasure of the taste, but the swift arrival of the heat and the effect. The measures had their own slang, the language of the trade, the quartern and the half-quartern, the penny dram, the small quantities by which the spirit was doled out to a people who bought it in the smallest amounts their pennies would stretch to. The vessels were as humble as the measures. There were no fine glasses in the cheap gin shops, but battered cups and little pots and shared measures, sometimes a single cup passed from hand to hand, the gin poured into whatever would hold it. In the rougher places, the spirit was served through a hatch or over a plain board, laid across barrels, the simplest possible apparatus of sale. A barrel and a measure and a cup and a counter being the whole of what a dram-shop required. And the drinking was woven into the rhythm of the working day in a way that alarmed the respectable, the labourer stopping for a dram on the way to work to fortify himself against the cold and the toil, stopping again at midday, stopping again at the day's end, the gin punctuating the hours of labour, available on every corner, cheap enough to be a constant companion rather than an occasional indulgence. It is this constant, casual, woven-in quality of the drinking that distinguished the gin craze from ordinary drunkenness, and that frightened the reformers so. People had always got drunk on beer and ale and wine, at festivals and fairs and in the alehouse of an evening. What was new with gin was its sheer availability and cheapness, the way it could be had at any hour on any corner for the smallest of coins, so that drinking ceased to be an occasion and became a continuous possibility, threaded through the whole of the day and the whole of the city. The dram taken standing at the counter, the penny's worth swallowed in the street, the small measure knocked back between one task and the next, multiplied across a vast population and a great number of selling places, added up to the extraordinary tide of consumption that gave the craze its name, and it was the smallness and the cheapness and the constant availability of each single dram that made the great flood of the whole possible. I want to follow more closely the strange truth that the powerful of England, for a long while, had a true interest in keeping the poor of London drunk, for it is one of the harder lessons of the full history, and it explains a great deal that would otherwise seem merely careless. The men who sat in the Parliament of the early 18th century, the men who made the laws that let the gin trade flourish, were overwhelmingly landowners, men whose wealth came from the land and from the grain that the land yielded. And these men had, in the opening decades of the century, a problem, for the long run of good harvests had produced grain in such abundance that its price had fallen, and falling grain prices meant falling rents and falling incomes for the very men who governed the country. The gin trade offered these men a solution almost too convenient to resist. A distilling industry that consumed vast quantities of grain to make its spirit created a new and hungry market for exactly the surplus that was depressing the price. The more gin the distillers made, the more grain they bought, and the more grain they bought, the better the price the landowners received for their harvests. The interests of the distillers and the interests of the landed gentlemen in Parliament ran, in this matter, in perfect harmony, and it is no accident that the laws of the period were so favourable to the gin trade, for the men who made those laws had a direct and personal stake in seeing it flourish. The encouragement of distilling was, among other things, a piece of agricultural policy, a way of propping up grain prices and landed incomes by manufacturing a vast new demand for the nation's surplus corn, and the fact that this policy happened to be drowning the poor of London weighed for a long time very lightly against the solid benefit to the men of land. This is worth stating plainly, that the gin craze was not merely an accident or a failure of oversight, but was, in its origins, an actively encouraged consequence of a policy that served the powerful at the expense of the powerless. The cheap gin that ruined the townsfolk of London was cheap in part because Parliament had deliberately made it so to consume the grain surplus and support the rents of the landowning class to which the members of Parliament themselves belonged, and when, in the end, the harm grew too great and too visible to ignore, one of the matters that finally produced effective action possible was that the harvests had failed, the grain had grown dear, the landed interest no longer needed the trade to soak up a surplus that no longer existed, and so the quiet weight of the powerful in favour of cheap gin at last lifted. The poor got their relief, in part because the men who governed them had ceased to profit from their drinking. Let us spend a while with the names the age gave to the gin, for the people who drank it and feared it and mourned it called it by names that have come down to us, trailing the complete atmosphere of those years, and the names tell their own story. The most famous of them, and the most telling, is Madame Geneva. The word Geneva was simply the English shortening of the Dutch Geneva, on its way to becoming the Kurt Geneid, but the population made of it a person, a lady, Madame Geneva, half affectionate and half accusing, as though the djinn were a woman who had bewitched the city, a seductress and a destroyer both, beloved and blamed in the same breath. When the Act of 1736 seemed to threaten her with death, it was for Madame Geneva that the people held their mock funerals in the streets, processing in bitter grief for the lady who had been their comfort, and the very name shows how deep and how complicated their feeling for the djinn ran. Not simple appetite, but something closer to a troubled love. Zusufa. There was another name, darker and sadder, that fixed itself to the djinn and has never left it, and that was Mother's Ruin. It carried all the freight of the age's particular horror at the gin-drinking woman, the mother undone by the spirit, the family destroyed, and it named in 2 words the whole tragedy that the reformers and the artist had laboured to depict, the drink that ruined the mothers, and through them the children and the homes. Mother's Ruin was not an affectionate name like Madame Geneva, but an accusing and a sorrowful one, and that the same drink could carry both, the half-loved Madame Geneva and the accusing Mother's Ruin, captures the deep doubleness of the thing, the relief and the destruction bound together in the one cheap cup. These names outlived the crisis that produced them, and were taken up by each later age that had its own reasons to talk about gin, so that they became a kind of inheritance, a vocabulary of warning and of rueful affection that every later generation could draw upon. To name a thing is to begin to master it, or at least to hold it at a little distance, and the common people of the gin districts, naming their cheap destroyer Madame Geneva and Mother's Ruin, were doing something very human, making of the formless flood of the spirit, a figure they could love and blame, and mourn and curse, giving the great impersonal force of the trade a face and a name. The names are almost all that most of us now remember of the vast tragedy, Madame Geneva and Mother's Ruin, the half-loved lady and the ruin of mothers, the 2 names that the drowning city gave to the gin that was drowning it. There is a remedy that rose in time against the gin gentler than the law and slower than the price of grain, and it is worth following, though it belongs more to the age that came after the worst of the craze than to the craze itself. It was the rise of the temperance spirit, the movement against strong drink that would grow over the later part of the century and into the one that followed, into a great campaign, and it answered the gin, not with prohibition or with taxes, but with a different vision of how the wretched might find their warmth and their company and their comfort. For the reformers of this gentler kind understood something the earlier ones had missed, that you could not simply take the gin away from people whose lives were hard without offering them something in its place, some other glow, some other gathering, some other ease at the end of the day. And the thing they offered, more and more, was tea. It seems a small thing, almost a comical one, to set the tea table against the gin shop, and yet there was real wisdom in it, for the tea answered some of the same needs that the gin had answered, without the destruction. It was warm, and it was cheap enough in time to come within the reach of the poor, and above all it was sociable, a thing to be taken in company, around a table, in warmth and talk, so that the temperance tea gathering could offer something of the same human comfort that the dram-shop had offered, the warmth and the company and the ease, but sober and safe and kindly. The temperance tea party, the gathering of people around the warm pot in place of the gin barrel, was a genuine attempt to meet the deep human needs that had driven the drinking, to give the labouring poor their warmth and their fellowship in a form that would not destroy them. It would be too neat to say that tea defeated gin, for the wide flood had already ebbed, brought down by the law and the price of grain, before the temperance movement reached its full strength, and the story of how the nation's drinking changed is longer and more tangled than any simple replacement of the one drink by the other. But there is a truth in the image all the same, the warm, sober tea table rising in the place of the gin shop, the same human warmth sought in a kindlier form, and it points to the actual answer that the total sad history had been groping toward, which was never simply to take the solace away, but to offer a better comfort in its place. The people had reached for the gin because their lives were cold and hard, and the gin was warm and cheap, and the truest remedy was never the law or the tax alone, but the slow bettering of the lives and the offering of other glow, the tea table and the kindlier gathering, the warmth without the ruin, and in that gentle answer, more than in all the acts of Parliament, lay the real and lasting easing of the thirst that had drowned the city. The gin did not vanish when the great flood ebbed, and it is worth following it a little way into its long afterlife, for the spirit settled, after the middle of the century, into a more ordinary place in the national life, no longer the engine of a social catastrophe, but simply one of the things that people drank. And then, in the century that followed, the gin rose again, transformed into something that ordinary folk of the dram-shops would scarcely have recognised, for the age that came after produced its own kind of gin establishment, and it was a glittering thing where the old one had been squalid. The Gin Palace, which spread through London and the other great cities in the early decades of the 1800s, was a place of gaslight and gleaming mahogany and polished brass and engraved glass, a deliberately gorgeous environment built to draw the poor in off the grey streets with a vision of warmth and light and splendour they could find nowhere else in their lives. It was the descendant of the dram shop, the Gin Palace, selling much the same cheap spirit to much the same poor population for much the same reason, the cheap escape from brutal lives. But it had dressed itself in magnificence, traded the low dim room for a glittering hall of light and mirrors. The poor who stepped in from the cold grey street found themselves, for the price of their drink, in a palace, surrounded by gleaming brass and shining glass and brilliant light, and the contrast between that gorgeous interior and the squalor of the streets outside was the whole seductive power of the place, a glimpse of splendour for people whose lives held little of it. The reformers of that later age looked upon the Gin Palace with the same horror their predecessors had felt for the dram shop, seeing in its glittering frontage the same old enemy in a new and more dangerous costume. And the memory of the original craze was pressed into service in these later struggles. The terrible image of Gin Lane reproduced and circulated, the cautionary tale of the 1730s and 40s told and retold as a warning of what drink could do to a people. Each age that fought its own battle over strong drink reached back to the gin craze for its imagery and its arguments, and the figure of the drunken mother and the falling child, the collapsing street, the fat pawnbroker grown rich on ruin, became a kind of permanent vocabulary for the dangers of intoxication, ready to be summoned whenever a new fear about a new substance required a precedent and a picture. The gin craze became in this way larger than itself, a parable as much as a piece of history, the great example of a society poisoning itself, fixed forever in the lines of a single engraving, and that is the form in which it has mostly come down to us, the terrible warning, the cautionary tale, the city that drowned in gin. Why London, we might ask, and why then? For other cities had cheap spirits, and other ages had strong drink, and yet it was London, in these particular decades, that produced the extraordinary thing we have been walking through. The answer lies in a coming together, a convergence of conditions that met upon one city at one time, and it is worth gathering them up, for each on its own would have produced nothing remarkable, and only their meeting produced the flood. There was the cheap grain, the surplus harvests driving down the price of the raw material. There was the open trade, the deliberate throwing open of distilling that let anyone make and sell the spirit. There was the war with France, closing off the brandy that the comfortable had drunk, and creating both a gap in the market and a patriotic reason to fill it with English gin. That there was the encouragement of the landed men in Parliament who wanted the grain consumed. And there was London itself, the particular character of the city in those years, which made it uniquely combustible. London was growing explosively, swelling with people drawn in from the countryside faster than the city could absorb them, crowding into the poor parishes in numbers that overwhelmed every provision for them. These were uprooted people, many of them cut loose from the villages and the customs and the watchful communities that had governed their lives, set down in the vast anonymous churn of the great city, poor, insecure, often without steady work, living in conditions of crowding and cold and squalor. They were exactly the population most vulnerable to the cheap escape that the gin offered. People with hard lives and few eases and little to lose, set down in a city where the cheap escape waited on every corner, and the meeting of that population with that drink in that place was the spark in the powder. No single one of these conditions would have been enough. Cheap grain without open trade, or open trade without the crushing urban poverty, or the poverty without the cheap available spirit, would each have passed without catastrophe. It was the convergence, the coming together of cheap grain and open distilling and wartime policy and explosive growth and uprooted vulnerable people and a deliberate encouragement of the trade, all in one city in one span of decades, that produced the gin craze. And that is why it was London, and why it was then, and why the thing burned so fiercely and then, as the conditions shifted, subsided. For a fire needs all its elements together, the fuel and the air and the spark. And when the harvests failed, and the grain grew dear, and the laws were tightened, one of the necessary elements was taken away, and the fire, deprived of what it fed on, slowly went out. It is a sobering way to understand a great social catastrophe as a kind of combustion that needs its every element present at once, for it means that such matters are neither inevitable nor mysterious, but assembled, piece by piece, out of ordinary conditions that happen to converge, and that they can be ended, in the same way, by the removal of any one of the elements that feed them. Let us walk deeper into the streets themselves, into the maze of courts and alleys that made up the people parishes, for the place shaped the city's people and their drinking, and to feel the craze you must feel the streets it grew in. Saint Giles was the most notorious of them, a parish whose very name became a byword for squalor, a dense tangle of narrow ways and blind courts, and leaning houses packed so close that the daylight scarcely reached the ground between them, where men and women of the lowest sort were crammed together in numbers beyond counting. The houses were old and decayed, divided and subdivided, until a single room might hold an entire family or more. The cellars below the street lived in too, damp and dark and crowded, the whole place a warren of human habitation piled upon itself, with no air and no light and no cleanliness possible in it. The courts opened off the streets through narrow covered passages, dark tunnels leading into hidden squares of packed houses, where the life of the parish went on out of sight of the main ways, the washing strung overhead, the children swarming in the filth of the unpaved ground, the doors standing open onto the crowded rooms within. There was no privacy and no quiet. The lives of the poor lived close and loud and public, every sound carrying through the thin walls and the open doors, the full court a single crowded, clamorous organism of human living. And through it all ran the want, the constant pressing want of people who never had quite enough. Not enough food, not enough heat, not enough work, not enough of anything but each other and the hardness of their lives. It was in these courts and alleys that the dram-shops did their best trade, for the gin was the one bright thing in the grey want of the place, the one warmth and the one escape, and it was woven into the very fabric of the streets, sold from the front rooms and the cellars and the back premises all through the Warren. To walk into Saint Giles of an evening was to walk into a world of crowding and squalor and want unimaginable to us, and to find, threaded all through it, the warm-lit dram-shops glowing on the corners, the one comfort the place afforded, drawing the cold and the hungry and the hopeless in from the grey streets for their pennyworth of forgetting. The streets made the craze as much as the gin did, the crushing want of the crowded parishes driving the labouring sort to the one cheap ease within their reach. And you cannot understand the drinking without understanding the streets, the dark tangled, crowded warrens of the destitute, where the gin burned brightest because the lives around it were darkest. Let your mind rest now, for a little while, on the simple sensory world of these streets at evening. Though it was a hard place, it was a vivid one, full of light and sound and movement, and there is a strange beauty in it that suits the drift toward sleep. Think of the light first, the failing daylight giving way to the warm yellow glow of the dram-shops and the ale-houses, the candles and the tallow lamps in the windows, the firelight spilling from the open doors, so that the dark streets were threaded with pools of warm light, each one a gathering place, a refuge of glow and company in the gathering cold. The link boys carried their flaming torches through the dim to light the way for those who could pay, small moving flames bobbing through the streets, and here and there an oil lamp on its bracket cast its dim circle on the cobbles. Think of the sounds, the huge layered noise of the crowded city at evening, the cries of the last street sellers calling their wares, the rattle and clatter of cartwheels and hooves on the broken stones, the voices everywhere, talking and calling and singing and quarrelling, the whole human clamour of too many people living too close together. From the dram-shops and the ale-houses came the noise of the gathered drinkers, the talk and the laughter and the songs, the warm human sound of company, spilling out into the streets through the open doors. And under it all the deeper sounds of the city, the church bells marking the hours, the distant cries of the watch, the vast murmur of the greatest city in the age settling toward its night. But not. Think of the warmth and the cold together, the bitter chill of the dark streets and the sudden warmth of the lit rooms, the contrast that drew the poor in from the one to the other, the chill of poverty and the heat of the gathering place, the two woven together all through the evening streets. It is that contrast, more than anything, that holds the complete picture, the bitter chill without and the warm light within, the grim street and the glowing room, the two faces of the world of the gin pressed up against each other on every corner of the old parishes, and the people moving always from the one toward the other, out of the cold and into the warmth, drawn by the light and the company and the cheap ease, the bright rooms glowing like small fires scattered through the great cold dark of the city. It was a hard world, and a squalid one, and full of want and suffering, and yet it had its glow and its light and its company too, its bright lit rooms where the poor gathered against the dim. And there is a tenderness in imagining it so, the snug glowing dram-shops and ale-houses scattered through the shadowed bitter streets, the gathered people and the spilling light and the human warmth of company against the night. Let that gentle picture hold you now as you drift towards sleep, the warm lights of the old streets glowing through the black, the gathered people, the human warmth against the chill, the vivid living world of the city at evening in the age of gin. We should understand the lives that drove the population to the gin, the daily round of labour and want that made the cheap escape so necessary, for the drinking makes no sense torn from the lives. The poor of London worked, when they could find work, at labour that was bitter and uncertain and ill-paid, the men as porters and labourers and carriers, hauling and lifting and carrying through the long days, the women as washerwomen and street sellers and servants and workers in the countless small trades of the city, the whole population scraping a living by the strength of their bodies in a world that paid them as little as it could. The work was casual, much of it taken by the day or the hour, so that a person might labour hard one day and find nothing the next, living always on the edge, never certain of the next meal or the next week's rent. They lived in the single rooms and the crowded cellars we have walked through, paying out a cruel portion of their meagre earnings for the bare shelter, cold in the winter, for want of fuel, hungry often, their food poor and monotonous, bread and a little cheese, a scrap of meat when there was money for it, weak beer and now the cheap gin. They fell sick without remedy, for the doctor was beyond their means and the medicine of the age could do little in any case, and they watched their children sicken and die in numbers that we can scarcely bear to contemplate, the death of children a constant and a familiar grief in the crowded parishes. It was a life lived close to the bone, close to hunger and cold and sickness and death, with small ease and less security, and no certainty of anything but the hardness of the next day. Against all this set the gin, cheap and warm and strong, and the drinking explains itself. For a coin or two, a person worn down by such a life could buy an hour of warmth and forgetting, could lift themselves out of the cold and the hunger and the fear, could find in the warm-lit dram-shop among their neighbours a brief ease that nothing else in their lives afforded. It was a poor bargain. The gin paid for dearly in health and money, and sometimes in everything, but it was the bargain on offer, the one cheap consolation within reach of people who had almost nothing, and they took it, as people in such lives have always taken whatever ease they could find. The lives were the cause, and the gin was the symptom, and the vast tragedy of the craze grew in the end from the simple, unbearable hardness of the lives of the London poor, and the cheap, warm forgetting that was the only mercy on offer. Let us go to the other end of the trade for a while, away from the dram shop and up to the vast distilleries where the gin was made in bulk, for the trade had its giants as well as its small cellars, and the makers of the spirit were a power in the land. At the top of the trade stood the major distillers, the men who took in the grain by the wagon load, and turned it into spirit by the thousands of gallons, working big copper stills in large premises, the manufacturers who supplied the raw spirit that the countless small cellars retailed to working folk. These were sizable businesses, the major distilling houses, and the men who ran them grew wealthy and influential, a genuine interest in the commercial and political life of the city, spending their trade against the reformers and the regulators with all the weight that wealth could command. The distillery itself was a place of heat and smell and labour, the vast stills working, the mash fermenting in its vast vessels, the spirit running off to be collected, the air thick with the reek of the fermentation and the distillation, the total place a manufactory of intoxication, working day and night to feed the thirst of the city. From these wide works, the raw spirit flowed out to the trade, to the smaller rectifiers who flavoured and finished it, and on to the multitude of sellers great and small who brought it at last to the city's poor. It was an industry, the gin trade, a considerable industry employing many and enriching some, woven into the commercial fabric of the city, and the great distillers at the head of it were men of weight and consequence, not the squalid figures of the dram shop, but prosperous men of business growing rich on the manufacture of the cheap spirit. This is worth holding in mind against the image of the craze as simply a thing of the squalid poor and their squalid drinking, for behind the dram shop and the falling child stood a whole structure of commerce and profit, reaching up to the wealthy distillers and the landed men in Parliament, a wide machine for turning the surplus grain of the countryside into the cheap gin of the slums and the profits of the powerful. The poor drank and suffered at the bottom of it. But the gin that ruined them enriched a long chain of others on its way down to them, the landowners and the distillers and the sellers, and the whole trade was a structure of profit built upon the thirst and the misery of the people, the wealth flowing up as the gin flowed down. To see the craze entire, you must see the whole of that structure, not only the dram shop at the bottom, but the large distillery and the landed estate above it, the total machine of grain and spirit and profit that fed the drowning streets. There is a question that the artist's two prints set before us, the question of beer, for he held up the good English beer against the foreign gin as health against ruin, and the contrast between the two drinks runs all through the history of the craze. Beer had been the everyday drink of the English people for centuries, the common drink of rich and poor alike, brewed strong and brewed small, the small beer weak enough to be drunk all day by everyone, including the children, taken in place of the water that was so often unsafe to drink. It was nourishing, in its way, the beer, made from malted grain and carrying real sustenance, and it was woven into the daily life of the multitude as a wholesome and accustomed thing, the drink of the alehouse and the table and the harvest field, drunk in great quantity but rarely to the ruin that the gin produced. The difference between the beer and the gin was the difference between a mild drink taken in quantity and a fierce one taken for its strength. A person might drink beer all day and grow merry or even drunk, but the beer was weak enough and filling enough that the body could only hold so much, and the drinking of it was a slow and a social and a relatively harmless thing. The gin was another matter altogether, so strong that a small cheap measure could render a person insensible, so concentrated that the body could take in a ruinous dose before it knew, and it was this concentrated strength, this power to deliver oblivion in a few slight swallows for a few modest coins, that made the gin so much more dangerous than the beer it largely displaced among the needy. And so the reformers and the artist with them came to see the beer almost as an ally against the gin, the wholesome native drink against the ruinous foreign one. And there was real sense in it, for a population that drank its beer was a far healthier and a far safer thing than a population that drank its gin. When the gin grew dear at last and the labouring poor drifted back toward the beer, it was widely felt as a return to health and sanity, the nation coming back to its senses and its proper drink after the long madness of the gin. The beer was no innocent thing, and drunkenness on beer was true enough, but it was a milder and an older and a more manageable trouble than the fierce new ruin of the gin, and the long contest between the two drinks, the wholesome beer and the ruinous gin, was one of the running themes of the full age, settled at last by the rising price of the gin and the people's return to the older, milder, safer drink of their ancestors. There is a reason the common throng drank beer and gin rather than water, and it is worth pausing on, for it tells us something essential about the city and its thirst. The water of London was not safe to drink, and everyone knew it. There was no clean supply piped to the houses of the poor, no system for delivering wholesome water to the crowded parishes, and what water there was came from the river that served also as the city's great open sewer, or from wells and pumps that were all too often fouled by the filth that soaked through the crowded ground. To drink the water plain was to risk the fluxes and the fevers that the foul water carried, and the people knew it by hard experience, and avoided the water as a dangerous thing. And so they drank instead the drinks that were safer than the water, the beer whose brewing made it safe, and now the gin whose strength killed whatever the water might have carried. There was a grim logic in it, that in a city without clean water, the cheap strong drink was, in this one narrow sense, safer than the water it replaced, and the common people drank it in part for that reason, because the alternative, the foul water of the crowded city, was its own kind of poison. We who turn a tap for clean water without a thought can scarcely imagine a great city in which the plain water was a danger and the drink a refuge from it. But that was the London of the craze, a city of 500,000 and more without a safe drink of water to be had, and the thirst that the gin slaked was in part a real and a desperate thirst that the city itself, in its filth and its want, had created. It is one more thread in the tangle of causes that produced the craze, the want of clean water, woven in among the cheap grain and the open trade and the crushing poverty, one more pressure driving the townsfolk toward the drink. The reformers who railed against the gin rarely thought to ask what the city's people were to drink instead. In a city where the water was poison and the milk adulterated, and the safe drinks all carried their own dangers, and the answer, that there was little safe to drink, and the gin at least was warm and cheap, and killed the contagion, was part of the deep reasonableness of the drinking that the moralists could never see. The city that had no clean water for its poor could hardly wonder that its poor drank gin, and the foul water and the cheap spirit were two faces of the same neglect. The great city grown too fast and too crowded to provide its people even the first necessity of clean water, so that they drank perforce the drinks that were safer than the water, and drowned in part for the want of a clean well. Let us return to the informers, for they were among the most hated figures of the whole craze, and their strange and dangerous trade tells us much about how the people felt toward the law that tried to take their gin. When the Act of 1736 made the selling of gin without the costly licence unlawful, it could not hope to enforce the law by its own officers alone, for the trade was far too vast and too dispersed, and so it offered rewards to private persons who would inform against the illegal sellers, a bounty for each conviction, and thereby created, almost overnight, a new trade in informing. There sprang up a class of professional informers, men and women who made their living by spying out the illegal gin sellers and reporting them for the reward, moving through the poor districts as paid spies against their own neighbours. The people hated them with a deep and a dangerous hatred, for the informer was felt to be a traitor to his own kind, a person who sold his neighbours to the distant law for money, who fattened on the bounties paid for the wreck of poor sellers trying to scrape a living. The informers worked in actual peril, for when one was discovered the crowd might turn on him, and there were informers mobbed and beaten in the streets, hunted and driven out, and some who paid with their lives for their dangerous trade, killed by the fury of the wretched they had informed against. The hatred of the informer was the hatred of a people for a law they felt to be unjust, an intrusion of the distant state into a matter they considered their own, and the informer, the visible agent of that intruding law, drew upon himself the complete weight of the popular anger. It is a telling thing, this hatred of the informer, for it shows how completely the population rejected the law that tried to take their gin, how they regarded the selling and the drinking of the spirit not as a crime, but as their own affair, and the law against it as a kind of tyranny to be resisted and evaded by every means. The informer, taking the law's money to betray his neighbours, stood on the wrong side of that feeling, and bore the brunt of it, hated and hunted and sometimes killed, the despised symbol of the despised law. And his hated trade was in the end one more sign of why the prohibition failed, for a law that can be enforced only by paid spies, hated and resisted by the whole population among whom it operates, is a law already defeated. And the fury that fell upon the informers was the measure of how completely the Act of 1736 had set itself against the will of the population, and how surely it was bound to fail. The church and the religion of the age looked upon the gin with horror, and the voice of the pulpit was raised facing it, and the religious dimension of the struggle is part of the story, for the age was a religious one, and the drinking was seen by many as a matter of the soul as much as the body. The clergy preached amid the drunkenness and the disorder, in the face of the ruin of families and the neglect of children and the wreck of souls that the gin produced. And they saw in the craze a great moral and spiritual evil. The people sunk in vice and degradation, the soul as well as the body destroyed by the cheap spirit. The pulpit was one of the voices raised against the trade, the religious conscience of the age recoiling from the spectacle of the drowning poor. There was real compassion in some of this religious concern, a genuine grief at the suffering and the ruin, a wish to save the city's poor from the destruction of the gin, and the religious reformers laboured, in their way, to relieve the misery and to combat the trade, moved by a genuine love for the suffering poor. But there was sometimes a hardness in it too, a readiness to see the drinking as a sin to be condemned rather than a misery to be relieved, to blame the poor for their vice rather than to ask what had driven them to it. And the religious voice raised over the gin was sometimes the voice of judgment more than of mercy, condemning the sinners rather than easing the suffering. The truest of the religious voices, though, were those that saw past the sin to the suffering, that understood the drinking as the symptom of a deeper misery, and sought to relieve the misery rather than merely to condemn the vice. For the deepest teaching of the religion the age professed was a teaching of mercy and compassion for the suffering, and those who held to it most truly looked upon the drowning poor, not with condemnation, but with pity, seeking to relieve the want and the misery that drove ordinary folk to the drink, to ease the suffering rather than to punish the symptom. The Church's response to the gin was mixed, as all human responses are, part judgment and part mercy, part condemnation of the vice and part compassion for the suffering. And the best of it was the compassion, the genuine grief at the ruin of the labouring sort and the genuine labour to relieve it, the religious conscience of the age at its truest reaching past the easy condemnation of the drinking to the harder work of easing the misery that lay beneath it. And there is a lesson in that for any age, religious or not, that the easy condemnation of a suffering people's vices is the cheapest of all responses, and the hardest and the truest is the patient work of easing the suffering itself, the mercy that looks past the sin to the wound beneath it. I want to take you to one of the strangest scenes of the whole craze, the mock funerals that the labouring poor held for Madame Geneva when the law seemed to threaten her with death, for it captures, as nothing else does, the deep and complicated feeling of the people for the gin. When the Act of 1736 was passed, meaning to suppress the trade, men and women of the gin districts treated it as a death, the death of their beloved and blamed Madame Geneva, and they marked it with a strange, bitter theatre in the streets. There were mock funeral processions, the people parading with a coffin or an effigy of the dead lady, draped in black, with mourners following in a parody of grief, lamenting the passing of their cheap comfort, the whole thing half a jest and half a real expression of loss, a bitter festival of mourning for the gin the law had killed. It was a kind of carnival, these mock funerals, the common people taking a bitter pleasure in the theatre of grief, mocking the law that had tried to take their drink even as they mourned the drink itself. The procession at once a lament and a protest and a defiance. There was drinking, of course, a last huge drinking for the supposed death of the gin, the labouring sort gathering to see Madame Geneva out of the world with the very spirit whose passing they mourned, and the streets on the eve of the act were said to have been full of a wild and desperate revelry, the city's people drinking themselves into a stupor in a last farewell to the cheap relief the law was taking from them. And the mockery had its sharp edge of true anger, for the funerals were a protest as much as a lament, a way for the people to show their contempt for the law and the distant parliament that had made it, to declare in the streets that they would not quietly accept the taking of their gin. The entire strange scene, the black-draped coffins and the parodied grief and the wild last drinking and the bitter mockery of the law, was the poor's answer to the Act of 1736, an answer of grief and defiance and contempt, and it told the authorities, had they cared to listen, exactly how their law would fare, for a people who mourn the forbidden thing with mock funerals in the streets are a people who have no intention of giving it up. The mock funerals of Madame Geneva are among the most vivid and the most telling images of the whole craze, the drowning city mourning and mocking and defying all at once over the coffin of its cheap destroyer, and they capture, better than any argument, the deep and tangled bond between working folk and the gin that the law could never hope to break by force. We must speak, gently and with care, of the children of the gin districts, for they were the most vulnerable of all who lived in the shadow of the craze, and their lot asks to be told with tenderness. Childhood in the crowded parishes was perilous beyond our imagining, for a terrible portion of the children born there did not live to grow up, carried off by the fevers and the fluxes and the countless sicknesses of an age that could do so little to save them, and the death of children was a constant and a familiar grief in the gin districts as everywhere among the poor. Into this hard world the gin came as one more peril among many, for the children of drinking parents suffered for the drinking, going hungry when the money went for gin, neglected when the parents were lost to the bottle, growing up in homes that the spirit had emptied of comfort and care. There was a particular sorrow in the way the gin reached even the youngest, for it was given to children, sometimes, to quiet them. A few drops to still a crying infant or settle a restless child, by parents who knew no better, and reached for the cheap spirit as the answer to a child's distress, as they reached for it as the answer to their own. The harm of this, to the small bodies of the young, was real and grievous, and it was one of the saddest aspects of the whole craze. The gin reaching down even to the cradle, the cheap comfort of the parents become a peril to the children. The artist knew this, and put it in his terrible image, the mother giving the gin to her infant, for he knew it was among the things that would horrify the age most deeply, the spirit reaching even to the youngest and most innocent. And yet there was love in the gin districts too fierce and actual, the love of poor parents for their children, expressed in such circumstances and with such poor means as the hard lives allowed. For every parent lost to the bottle, there were many who fought to keep their children fed and clothed and alive against all the weight of poverty, who went without that the children might eat, who grieved with a grief beyond words when the children died, as so many did. The children of the gin districts grew up in want and peril, and the shadow of the drink, and many were harmed by it, and many died, and it was a hard and a sorrowful thing. But they grew up too in homes where, often, they were loved fiercely and helplessly, by parents fighting a losing battle against the poverty that ground them all down, and the truest picture of childhood in the age of gin holds both the sorrow and the love together. The real harm of the drink and the genuine love of the lowest sort for their vulnerable young, the whole brutal, tender, perilous business of raising children in the drowning streets. There is one building in the gin districts that prospered while all around it decayed, and the artist set it at the heart of his image for a reason, and that was the pawnbroker's shop, for the pawnbroker and the gin seller were bound together in a grim partnership that fed upon the ruin of the poor. The pawnbroker lent money against goods, taking a person's possessions in pledge and advancing a small sum to meet them, to be redeemed when the money could be found, or forfeited when it could not. And in the gin districts, the pawnbroker did a roaring trade, for the drinkers who had spent their money on gin and needed more brought their goods to him to raise the price of another drink. The coat off a person's back, the tools of their trade, the pots and pans of the household, the very blankets from the bed, all went to the pawnbroker for the few coins he would lend against them, and a great part of those coins went straight to the gin seller. It was a spiral of ruin, this partnership of the pawnbroker and the gin shop, for the drinker pawned to drink, and drank away the money, and pawned again, sinking deeper with each turn, until everything of any value had passed to the pawnbroker, and there was nothing left to raise another coin upon. The artist showed it exactly, the prosperous pawnbroker's shop standing sound and busy amid the collapsing street, the desperate bringing their last goods to pledge, the carpenter pawning his tools and the housewife her cooking pots, surrendering the very means of their livelihood for the price of the gin. The pawnbroker grew fat in the image and in the life, on the ruin of the destitute, the one prosperous figure in the drowning parish, his prosperity built directly upon the desperation that the gin produced. There was real cruelty in the spiral, for the pawning of the tools of a trade was the pawning of the means of recovery. The carpenter who pledged his tools for gin, losing thereby the very means by which he might have earned his way back to solvency, sinking himself the deeper with each pledge. The pawnbroker and the gin seller between them caught the poor in a trap from which there was little escape, the one feeding the thirst and the other feeding the means to slake it, and the goods of the household flowing steadily from the home to the pawnshop, and the coins flowing from the pawnshop to the gin shop, until the home was stripped bare and the family ruined. It was one of the cruelest mechanisms of the whole craze, this partnership of pledge and drink, and the prosperous pawnbroker amid the ruin, fattening on the desperation of the poor, was rightly placed by the artist at the very heart of his vision of the drowning parish, the one who grew rich while all around him drowned. Let us think about what help there was for the needy of the gin districts, what provision the age made for those who fell into want. For it was little enough, and the want of it drove the population the harder toward the gin. The chief provision was the old system of parish relief, the poor law by which each parish was bound to care for its own destitute, providing a little money or bread or shelter to those who could not support themselves, funded by a rate levied on the property of the parish. It was a harsh and a grudging system, the parish relief, administered by men anxious above all to keep down the rates and to avoid encouraging the idle, and the help it gave was meagre and given reluctantly, hedged about with conditions and humiliations, a thin and bitter charity. The hardest edge of the system was the workhouse, the institution to which the destitute might be sent, where they would be housed and fed in return for their labour, but under conditions made deliberately harsh to deter all but the truly desperate. The workhouse, a place of confinement and hard labour and grim discipline, dreaded by the poor as a kind of prison for the crime of being destitute. To enter the workhouse was to surrender one's liberty and one's dignity, to be confined and set to labour and subjected to a harsh discipline, and the wretched avoided it as long as they possibly could, clinging to their wretched freedom outside its walls rather than submit to its grim shelter. The provision for the poor, such as it was designed to be feared, to be a last resort so harsh that none would seek it who could possibly avoid it. In such a world, with help so meagre and so grudging and so hedged with humiliation, it is no wonder that the multitude sought their solace where they could find it freely, in the warm lit dram-shop rather than the cold harsh charity of the parish. The gin asked nothing of them, imposed no humiliation, set no conditions, but gave its warmth and its forgetting freely to anyone with a coin, and in a world where every other help came wrapped in grudging and shame, the gin's easy comfort must have been the more precious for being so freely given. The meagreness of the provision for the labouring sort was one more pressure driving the city's poor to the drink. For a society that offered its destitute only the grudging parish dole and the dreaded workhouse could hardly wonder that they preferred the free, warm ease of the gin. And the cold charity of the age and the warm comfort of the spirit stood as two answers to the same want, the one harsh and humiliating, and the other easy and ruinous, and the people, understandably, chose the easy ruin over the harsh shame. Let us walk the streets at the dead of night now, when the dram-shops had emptied and the city slept its uneasy sleep, for the night had its own character in the gin districts and its own dangers, and it is part of the age we are coming to know. The streets of the poor parishes at night were dark beyond our imagining, for there was little lighting worth the name, only the dim oil lamps here and there, and the link boys' torches for those who could pay, and beyond their small pools of light, the streets lay in a thick darkness, the narrow ways and blind courts black and treacherous, full of unseen hazards underfoot, and unseen dangers in the shadows. To walk abroad at night in such a place was to take a real risk, and most who could stayed within doors after dark, behind what bolts and bars they had, leaving the night streets to the watch, and the lawless and the desperate. There was a watch, of a kind, the old system by which the parishes set men to guard the streets at night, the watchmen with their lanterns and their staves making their rounds, calling the hours, charged with keeping the peace and apprehending wrongdoers. But the watch was old and feeble and much mocked, the watchmen often aged and infirm, ill-paid and ill-equipped, no true match for the dangers of the night streets, and the protection they offered was thin indeed. The night belonged, in truth, to the gloom and to those who moved in it, and the gin had its part in the dangers of the black, for the drink made people reckless and quarrelsome, and the drunk abroad at night were both a danger and in danger, prey to the lawless and a hazard to themselves, stumbling through the black streets toward home or never reaching it at all. And yet the night had its quiet too, its hours of stillness when the vast clamorous city fell silent. At last the dram-shops shut, the streets emptied, the labouring poor sleeping in their crowded rooms, and a kind of peace settled over the drowning parishes. In those dead hours the city rested from its labour and its drinking, the warm lit rooms gone dark, the noise stilled, the vast crowded place sunk in sleep, and there was a stillness over the streets that the day never knew. Let that quiet hold you now as you drift toward your own sleep, the great city at last, at rest in the dead of the night, the dram-shops shut, and the streets emptied, and the common throng sleeping in their crowded rooms, the long grim clamorous day done, and the brief peace of the night settled over the drowning parishes, the vast city quiet at last under the dark sky, resting toward another hard day to come. The gin had its place among the fighting men of the age, the soldiers and the sailors, and their drinking is part of the story, for they were among the heaviest drinkers of the spirit, and carried its use through the wider world. The soldier's life was hard and harsh and often idle, long stretches of boredom and discomfort broken by spells of danger and terror, and the men sought their consolation in drink, as men in such lives have always done, the gin cheap and strong and ready to hand. The army issued spirits to its men, and the men bought more where they could, and drunkenness was a constant trouble in the ranks, the soldiers drinking to ease the boredom and the discomfort and the fear, the gin steadying them before the danger and dulling the misery of the camp and the march. The sailors were the same, the men of the merchant ships and the navy, whose lives were, if anything harder still, confined for long months in the cramped and dangerous world of the wooden ship, fed on poor provisions, subject to a brutal discipline, facing the perils of the sea and the enemy, and they too sought their refuge in drink, the spirits issued by the ship and brought ashore, the gin and the rum that eased the bitter life of the sea. And the fighting men carried the drink and the taste for it through the wider world, to the garrisons and the ports and the distant stations of the growing empire, spreading the use of the cheap, strong spirit far beyond the streets of London, so that the gin that drowned the city poor went also with the soldiers and the sailors to the ends of the earth. There was the phrase we have met, the Dutch courage, born among the fighting men, the spirit taken to steady the nerve before the danger, and it points to a real use of the drink among the soldiers and sailors, the chemical courage it lent before the battle or the storm. A man about to face the cannon or the boarding pike, the terror of the fight, might take his measure of spirits to steady himself, to dull the fear, to summon the reckless boldness that the drink could give. And there was a grim sense in it, for the fear was actual, and the drink did, in its narrow way, ease it. The gin among the fighting men was the same gin that drowned the city poor, sought for the same reasons, the easing of a hard and a frightening life, and the soldier before the battle, and the labourer before the cold grey day, reached for the same cheap comfort, the warmth and the courage, and the forgetting that the strong spirit gave, the borrowed Dutch courage of a swallow of gin. There were those in the age who set themselves to fight the gin out of conscience and conviction, the moral reformers, organised into their societies for the reformation of manners, and they are part of the story, for they laboured long against the drink and the disorder it bred. These were earnest people, many of them moved by religion, who looked upon the drunkenness and the vice and the disorder of the age with real horror and set themselves to combat it, forming societies to promote virtue and to suppress vice, to enforce the laws against drunkenness and disorder, to bring the offenders before the magistrates, to reform the manners of a people they saw as sunk in degradation. They were, in their way, the conscience of the age, or one part of it, the voice that would not accept the drowning of the poor in gin as simply the way of the world. Their methods were often harsh, and their understanding often narrow, for they tended to see the drinking as a moral failing in the people, a wickedness to be suppressed and punished, rather than as the symptom of the poverty and the hardness of the lives that we have come to understand it as. They pressed for the enforcement of the laws, for the punishment of the drunk and the disorderly, for the suppression of the dram-shops, approaching the problem as a matter of vice to be combated rather than of misery to be relieved, and the campaigns fell often upon the lowest sort who drank rather than upon the conditions that drove them to it. There was a hardness in their reforming zeal, a readiness to blame and to punish the victims of the craze rather than to ask what had driven them to the drink. And yet we should not dismiss them, for their horror at the suffering was genuine, and their labour against it was genuine, and they kept alive, through the worst of the craze, the conviction that the drowning of the poor was a wrong to be righted, and not merely endured. They gathered the evidence, and made the arguments, and pressed the authorities, and they were part, with the magistrate and the artist and the physicians, of the long campaign that brought the trade at last under control. Their understanding was narrow, and their methods often harsh, and they blamed the destitute too much, and the conditions too little, but they cared in their stern way about the suffering, and they laboured against it, and the easing of the craze owed something to their long and earnest campaign. Moral reformers were the stern conscience of the age, hard and narrow and earnest, and for all the narrowness of their vision they stood, when it mattered, on the side of those who would not let the drowning of the poor go unchallenged. We should speak carefully and without dwelling on the grim particulars of what the gin did to the bodies of those who drank it in such quantity, for the harm was real and physical as well as social, and it is part of the honest telling. The drinking of so much raw, strong spirit day after day did true damage to the body over time, and the physicians of the age, though they understood the workings of the body so imperfectly, could see plainly enough that the heavy gin drinkers suffered for their drinking, wasting and failing in ways that the drink plainly caused. The crude and adulterated nature of the cheapest gin made the harm the worse, for the poor were drinking not only strong spirit, but spirit fouled with cheap and sometimes poisonous adulterants, and the damage such stuff did to the body, taken in such quantity, was grievous. The harm fell hardest, as harm always does, on the townsfolk and the most desperate, those who drank the most and the worst, whose bodies, already weakened by poor food and harsh labour, and the want of every relief, had the least strength to withstand the assault of the drink. The heavy drinker wasted and sickened, the gin undermining a constitution already worn thin by poverty, and the physicians saw the characteristic ruin of the long gin drinker, the failing of the body under the steady assault of the spirit. It was one of the real harms of the craze, this physical ruin, set alongside the social harm and the crime and the neglect, the drink destroying the bodies of those who sought their comfort in it, the price of the cheap, warm forgetting paid at last in the destruction of the flesh. And yet we should remember, even here, the reason the people paid that price, for they did not drink themselves to ruin out of mere appetite or weakness, but out of the deep need for ease that their hard lives created, and the physical harm of the drink was the cruel price of the only comfort within their reach. The body paid for the ease the spirit gave, and paid dearly, and the heavy drinkers ruined their health in seeking the forgetting that made their lives bearable, a brutal and a sorrowful bargain, the solace of the cup paid for in the slow ruin of the body. It is one more face of the deep tragedy of the craze, that the cheap comfort the needy reached for in their suffering did its own harm to them in turn, the gin easing the misery of their lives even as it ruined their bodies, the warm forgetting and the slow ruin bound together in the same cheap cup, the price of the ease exacted at last from the flesh of those who could least afford to pay it. The gin worked its way into the songs and the speech and the popular culture of the age, for a thing so woven into the lives of the common people could not but leave its mark upon their words and their music, and the traces of it are worth gathering. There were the ballads and the songs of the streets, the cheap printed sheets hawked through the crowds that took the gin for their theme, some mocking and some mournful, some celebrating the cheap ease, and some lamenting the ruin, the whole tangled feeling of the population for the spirit finding voice in the rough music of the streets. The gin was sung of and joked about and lamented, woven into the popular culture as it was woven into the lives, a constant presence in the words and the music of the poor, and the gin left its mark upon the language, the names and the phrases that grew up around it passing into the common speech and lingering there long after, some of them with us still. Madame Geneva and Mother's Wreck we have met, the names the city's people gave the spirit, but there were many more, the slang of the trade and the drinking, the cant words for the gin and the drunkenness and the dram-shop, a total vocabulary of the craze that flourished in the speech of the streets. The very phrase about being drunk for a penny and dead drunk for twopence with clean straw to lie on while the stupor passed was said to have hung as a sign above the dram-shops, the boast of the cheap oblivion the gin afforded, and it has come down to us as the very motto of the craze, the cheap ruin advertised on the wall of the gin shop. These traces in the songs and the speech are precious, for they let us hear, faintly, the voices of the people themselves, the ordinary drinkers and sellers, whose feelings about the gin we would otherwise know only through the words of the reformers and the moralists who condemned them. In the ballads and the slang and the dram-shop boasts, we hear the wretched's own voice, their humour and their sorrow and their defiance, their tangled love and blame for the cheap spirit, the whole human feeling of the craze as ordinary folk themselves expressed it, before the moralists and the historians had their say. The gin lived in the culture as it lived in the streets, sung and joked about and named and lamented, and the traces it left in the songs and the speech of the age are among the truest windows we have into how the people themselves felt about the spirit, that was both their comfort and their ruin, the half-loved, half-cursed Madame Geneva of the drowning streets. Let us follow the gin a little way out of London, for though the craze was above all a London matter, the greatest and the worst of it gathered in the capital, the cheap spirit reached the other towns and cities too, and the wider spread of it is part of the story. The other great towns of the kingdom, The growing manufacturing places and the ports and the cities knew the gin too, and had their own dram-shops and their own drinking, though nowhere on the scale of London, for nowhere else gathered such a vast crowd of the uprooted poor in such crushing conditions. The cheap spirit spread along the roads and the rivers and the coasts, into the towns where the poor were gathering as the country changed, and wherever there were crowded, poor and cheap gin together, there the drinking took hold, a lesser echo of the great London craze. And the gin reached into the countryside too, though the country drinking was a different and a gentler thing, for the rural poor, hard as their lives often were, lived in a different world from the crowded city poor, more rooted, more watched by their communities, closer to the older ways and the older drinks. The gin came to the country markets and the country alehouses, and the country people drank it, but the great ruinous flood of it was a city thing, bred of the particular conditions of the crowded, uprooted urban poverty that the country, for all its hardships, did not share. The countryside knew the gin, but it did not drown in it as London did, for the conditions that produced the considerable craze, the vast anonymous crowding of the uprooted poor, were a city element, and above all a London thing. This wider spread of the gin, the lesser drinking of the other towns and the country, is worth knowing, for it shows both how far the cheap spirit reached and why the wide catastrophe gathered where it did. The gin went everywhere, into every town and out into the country, for it was cheap and strong and freely made, and wherever it went, the poor drank it. But the large drowning, the true craze, gathered in London, in the vast, crowded, uprooted poverty of the greatest city in the world, because it was there that all the conditions met, the cheap spirit and the crushing poverty, and the vast anonymous crowding together in the one terrible place. The wider spread shows the reach of the gin, and the concentration of the worst of it in London shows what it took to turn mere drinking into catastrophe, the particular convergence of conditions that gathered, in their full and terrible force, only in the drowning parishes of the capital. There is a lesson buried in the failure of the Act of 1736 that the people of the age only half understood, and that later ages would have to learn again and again in their own struggles with their own troubles, and it is worth drawing out, for it is one of the deepest things the craze has to teach. The lesson is that a thing which a great many people genuinely want, and which can be made cheaply and sold easily, cannot in practice be suppressed by simple prohibition, because the prohibition does not remove the want, it only drives the supply into the shadows, where it goes on at much the same scale but without regulation, without any control of its quality, without tax, and with an entire new apparatus of evasion and informing and violence layered on top. The Act of 1736 tried to abolish the gin by making its lawful sale impossible, and it failed completely, for the want of the gin remained, and the trade simply went underground, the selling continuing in defiance of the law, the quality if anything worsening for being beyond all oversight, the only new affairs created being the hated informers and the contempt for a law that could not be enforced. And the Act of 1751 succeeded precisely because it learned this lesson, because it did not try to abolish the trade but to tame it, to bring it under control and regulation and taxation rather than to drive it into the shadows, but working with the want rather than against it. It is a lesson that the world has had to learn again and again, in many countries and over many troubles, the failure of simple prohibition against a thing that people genuinely want, the way the forbidding only drives the trade into the dark and makes it worse, and the greater success of regulation and control, and the patient working with the want rather than the vain attempt to abolish it by force. The gin craze was in this a rehearsal for struggles that would be fought again and again in the centuries to come, over the gin and over other things, and the lesson of 1736 and 1751, the failure of the forbidding and the success of the taming, is one that each age has had to learn afresh, often at immense cost. The hard truth that you cannot simply forbid people the thing they want, but must work with the want, control it, tame it, and above all address the deeper need that drives it, if you would truly ease the harm it does. The gin craze came at a particular moment in the life of the city and the nation, a moment of great change, and it is worth seeing it against that larger movement, for the craze was in part a symptom of an age remaking itself. England in these decades was beginning the long transformation that would, in the century to come, turn it from a land of villages and fields into a land of cities and factories, the great movement of people from the countryside into the towns just beginning to gather its terrible force. London was swelling with the uprooted, the city's poor leaving the old-rooted life of the country villages for the anonymous churning life of the great city, drawn by the hope of work and driven by the changes remaking the countryside, and they crowded into the poor parishes faster than the city could house or feed or absorb them. It was this vast uprooting, this movement of people from the old-rooted communities into the new anonymous crowding of the city, that created the particular conditions in which the craze could flourish. The people who drowned in the gin were, many of them, the newly uprooted, cut loose from the villages and the customs and the watchful communities that had governed their lives and given them their place, set down in the vast indifferent churn of the city, poor and insecure and alone in the crowd. The old community that had once held people, watched them, given them their place and their support and their restraint, was gone for these uprooted thousands, and in its absence the cheap gin found them, the lonely and the lost and the uprooted, with nothing to hold them back from the drink and every reason to seek its consolation. The gin craze was in this sense one of the first of the great troubles of the modern city, the first taste of what the new world of the crowded anonymous town would bring, that uprooting of men and women from the old communities and their gathering in the new cities, creating conditions of loneliness and want and anonymity, in which the cheap escape of the drink could work its ruin. It was a sign of things to come, the craze, the first of the social troubles that the huge transformation would bring, and the drowning of the uprooted poor in the gin of the swelling city was a foretaste of the long struggle that the modern world would have with the troubles of its cities, the want and the loneliness and the cheap destructive comforts that the wide anonymous towns would breed. The craze was a thing of its moment, but it was also a beginning, the first grim lesson of the new urban world that was coming into being, and the drowning parishes of Georgian London were the early ground of a struggle that the modern city has been fighting, in one form or another, ever since. Let us rest again, for a while, in the glow of the dram-shop on a winter evening, for we have walked through a great deal of hardship and a great deal of history, and it is good to return to the simple human warmth at the heart of it all, the heat that drew the labouring poor in from the cold. Picture it once more, the low room with its tallow candles and its meagre fire, the warmth of it after the bitter street, the press of the gathered people, the soft glow of the light on their faces, the murmur of their talk, and the warmth of their company. For all the harm of the gin, for all the ruin it brought, there was this too at the heart of it, the simple human warmth of a gathering place, a warm-lit room where the cold and the weary came together at the end of the day to find each other and a little ease. Think of what it meant to them, the warmth and the company, after a day of hard labour in the cold, the gathering in the lit room among neighbours and friends, the talk and the laughter and the shared trouble, the human warmth of not being alone. The dram-shop was a poor place and a ruinous one, but it was also, for the people who gathered there, a refuge and a relief, a warm, bright room in the chill, dark world, a place of company and ease and belonging, and we should not forget, in our reckoning of the harm, this simple human good that drew the labouring sort in, the warmth and the fellowship and the brief ease at the end of the hard day. The need that the dram shop answered was an actual and a human need, the need for warmth and company and ease, and it was a need that the bitter cold world of the poor met nowhere else. Let that glow hold you now as you drift towards sleep, the warm-lit dram shop in the bitter dark streets, the gathered people, the soft light and the murmur of talk, the simple human warmth at the heart of the whole sad history. It was a hard place, the world of the gin districts, full of want and ruin and sorrow, and yet it had this heat too, these bright warm rooms where the people gathered against the cold and the dark and the hardness of their lives, and there is a deep tenderness in imagining them so, the chill and weary poor, finding their warmth and their company, and their brief ease in the glowing dram shop at the end of the long harsh day. Let it hold you gently as you sink toward sleep, the cosy light and the gathered people, and the human warmth against the unlit, the simple comfort at the heart of the drowning streets. It is worth remembering that the gin had begun, far back in its Dutch origins, as a medicine, and that the line between the spirit as a drink and the spirit as a remedy never quite vanished, for the medicine of the age made free use of strong drink, and the common people made free use of medicine, and the two ran together in ways that are part of the story. The apothecaries and the makers of remedies used spirits freely in their preparations, steeping their herbs and drugs in strong drink to draw out and preserve their virtues, and many a medicine of the age was, beneath its name and its claims, very largely spirit, that alcohol doing much of whatever good or comfort the remedy provided. The cordials and the strong waters that the apothecary sold hovered always on the line between medicine and drink, the spirituous preparations taken as much for the solace they gave as for any healing virtue. And working folk, in their turn, took their gin as a kind of medicine, for the spirit that warmed and eased and dulled the pain was, in an age with so little real relief to offer, a genuine comfort against the aches and the fevers and the miseries of the body, and many drank it for its supposed medicinal virtues as much as for its pleasure. The gin was held to be good against the cold, against the damp, to combat the gripings of the stomach and the aches of the body, a warming restorative ease, and there was a grain of truth in it. For the spirit did warm and did dull the pain in its narrow temporary way, and in an age with so little else to offer upon the constant suffering of the body, the kindly comfort of the gin was reached for as a remedy as well as a pleasure. This running together of the drink and the medicine is part of the deep texture of the age, the time before the sharp modern line between the two had been drawn, when the cordial was half a medicine, and the medicine half a cordial, and the gin itself a consolation that was reached for facing the body's suffering as much as for its pleasure. The people who drank the gin amid the cold and the pain and the misery of their hard lives were not entirely wrong to think of it as a kind of medicine, for it did in its way ease the suffering, dull the pain, drive off the cold, comfort the wretched, and in an age that had so little else to offer upon the constant suffering of the body, the warm, cheap relief of the spirit was a real, if a ruinous remedy. The gin that had begun as a medicine never quite ceased to be one, in the minds of the city's people who drank it, the comfort against the body's suffering and the soul's, the cheap, warm remedy for the pain of being poor and cold and human in a hard age. But let us follow the gin all the way down to our own time for a moment. For the spirit that drowned the Georgian poor did not die with the craze, but lived on transformed again and again, until it became something that the people of the dram-shops would find almost unrecognizable. After the great flood ebbed, the gin settled into a more ordinary place, and over the long years that followed it slowly rose in respectability, the cheap ruin of the slums becoming by degrees a more refined and a more reputable drink. The makers learned to distill it more cleanly, to flavour it more carefully, to make a gin that was no longer the raw, adulterated fire of the dram-shops, but a clean and balanced spirit. And the drink climbed over the generations, from the gutter toward the drawing room. There came a particular kind of gin, drier and cleaner than the sweetened spirits of the past, that gave its name to a full style, the London gin that would become known across the world, and the drink that had been the ruin of the city's poor became in time one of the city's proudest exports, a respected and a refined spirit carried to the ends of the earth. The gin found its way into the new fashion for mixed drinks, combined with other things into the cocktails of a later age. The spirit that had been knocked back raw in the dram-shops now mixed and refined and sipped in elegant company, its origins in the drowning slums all but forgotten. The long climb of the gin from Madame Geneva to the respectable spirit of the modern bar is one of the stranger journeys in the history of drink. The cheap destroyer of the Georgian poor become the refined pleasure of later ages. And in our own time the gin has risen higher still, become the object of a kind of craft and connoisseurship, the small distillers making their careful gins with their chosen botanicals, the drinkers savouring the subtleties of the juniper and the coriander and the angelica, the whole world of fine gin flourishing as never before. The descendants of Madame Geneva are sipped and savoured and discussed with a care that the poor of the dram-shops could never have imagined. The cheap raw ruin of the slums become a refined and a celebrated thing, sipped now in places of light and comfort by people who have never known cold or want. The long dark history of it forgotten, the drowning streets a thing of the distant past, and the long strange journey of the gin, from the careful Dutch Geneva through the drowning ruin of the Georgian Craze to the refined craft spirit of our own day, has come, in a sense, full circle, back to the care and the craft with which the Dutch had made it in the beginning, before the vast cheap flood drowned the London poor. The gin endures, transformed beyond recognition, and few who sip it now ever think of the drowning streets from which its dark fame first sprang. Let your mind rest for a while on the strange double nature of this complete history, before we draw toward the end of our evening, for the gin craze is one of those things that looks entirely different depending on the distance from which you view it. Stand close, in the street of Saint Giles on a winter night, and it is simply human, a cold and hungry people reaching for the one cheap glow within their grasp. The labourer and the washerwoman drinking their pennyworth at the counter, no more sinister in their own eyes than any of us when we pour ourselves a drink at the end of a brutal day. Stand a little further back, at the level of the parish and the city, and it becomes a social catastrophe, a measurable rise in death and disorder and misery, a genuine crisis that truly harmed a great many people and truly demanded a response. Stand further back still, at the distance of the centuries, and it becomes something else again, a parable, a turning point, the first of the modern world's grand struggles between a people's appetite for a cheap intoxicant and a society's attempt to govern that appetite. All three of these are true at once, and the craze is only properly understood when all three are held together, the human and the social and the historical, the penny dram and the falling child, and the long argument about prohibition that it began. It was a genuine thing that happened to real people, who drank because their lives were hard and the gin was cheap, and who suffered, many of them, true harm from the drinking. It was a real crisis that an actual society struggled, clumsily and cruelly and at last half successfully, to address. And it was the beginning of a story that has never ended. All three are true, and to hold them together is to understand the craze as it really was. Neither the simple morality tale of the moralists, the wicked poor brought low by their vice, nor any easy modern dismissal of the whole thing, but the full and tangled human truth of it, the cold and desperate people reaching for their cheap solace, the real harm and suffering that followed, and the long hard struggle of a society to govern an appetite it could neither satisfy nor suppress. The gin craze was all of these at once, the human reaching and the social ruin and the historical turning point, and the truest seeing of it holds them all together. The penny dram in the cold street, and the falling child in the famous print, and the long argument about how a society governs the appetites of its people. The whole strange tangled human truth of the city that drowned in gin. And perhaps that is the gift of looking at such a thing across the distance of the centuries, that we can hold all of it at once, the close human warmth, and the wider destruction, and the long historical meaning, where the multitude who lived through it could see only the part that was nearest to them, the cold and the dram and the grim day. We have the distance to see it whole, and the seeing entire is itself a kind of mercy, for it lets us understand the population of the drowning streets not as the moralists understood them, nor as they understood themselves, but with the fuller and the kinder understanding that distance and sympathy together can give. The gin craze belonged to a wider age of new appetites and new pleasures, for the same decades that saw the lowest sort drowning in cheap gin saw the entire nation discovering a host of new things to consume, and the gin was, in a sense, one face of a larger change in how people lived and what they craved. These were the decades when the great new commodities of the wider age were flooding into England, the sugar and the tobacco and the tea and the coffee and the chocolate. The new pleasures carried back from the distant lands by the merchant fleets, transforming the daily life and the daily appetites of the people. The age was learning to consume as it never had before, the new substances from across the age becoming, one by one, the daily habits of the nation, and the cheap gin was one of these new appetites, one of the new things that the changing world had set within the reach of the city's poor. There was a new spirit abroad in these decades, a spirit of consumption and appetite and the pursuit of new pleasures, as the growing trade and the growing wealth set more and more matters within the reach of more and more people, and the gin rode that new spirit as much as the tea and the sugar did. The same forces that brought the tea to the table, and the sugar to the tea, and the tobacco to the pipe, brought the cheap gin to the dram-shop. The wide expansion of trade and consumption that was remaking the appetites of the nation, and the drowning of the poor in gin was, in part, the dark face of that bright new age of consumption, the new appetite that ruined where the others merely pleased. It is worth seeing the gin in this wider light as one of the new consuming appetites of a changing age, for it reminds us that the craze was not some isolated madness, but a part of the larger transformation of how people lived and what they craved, the new world of trade and consumption and appetite that was coming into being. The tea and the sugar and the tobacco found their place in the life of the nation and stayed there, the new pleasures becoming the settled habits of the common throng, and the gin too found its place, though a darker one. The cheap new appetite that drowned the destitute before it too was tamed and settled into the ordinary life of the nation. The gin craze was a thing of its own, a particular catastrophe of a particular time and place, but it was also a part of the great new economy of consumption that was being born, one of the new appetites of a changing age, the dark face of the bright new world of trade and pleasure that was remaking the life of the nation. It is worth pausing on the difference between how the rich drank and how the poor drank, for drink was no monopoly of the poor, and the contrast between the drinking of the classes tells us much about the age and about why the gin drew the particular horror it did. The rich of the age drank, and drank heavily, the wine and the brandy and the port flowing freely at the tables of the prosperous, the gentlemen drinking deep after their dinners, drunkenness common enough among the comfortable classes. But the drinking of the rich was a different thing in the eyes of the age, conducted in private, in the dining room and the club, with costly drinks that only the prosperous could afford, and it drew little of the horror that fell upon the gin drinking of the needy. for it was hidden and genteel and did not spill into the streets. The poor drank in public, in the dram-shop and the alehouse and the street, their drinking visible to all, spilling out into the public ways, and they drank the cheap gin that was within their means, and their drunkenness was a public spectacle where the drunkenness of the wealthy was a private indulgence. The same vice, the heavy drinking, drew horror and condemnation when the poor practiced it in public with their cheap gin, and indulgence and amusement when the prosperous practiced it in private with their costly wine, and there was a deep unfairness in the double standard, the drunkenness of the wretched condemned as a vice and a disorder, while the drunkenness of the rich was winked at as the privilege of a gentleman. There was genuine hypocrisy in this, and some in the age saw it, the moralists who thundered against the gin drinking of the poor, while saying nothing of the brandy drinking of the rich. The litigant fell upon the cheap dram-shop, while the gentleman's cellar went untouched. The horror at the gin was, in part, a horror at the drinking of the poor, at the lower orders indulging in the public vice that the upper orders practised in private, and the particular venom of the campaign to check the gin owed something to this, to the affront of seeing the labouring poor drink and gather and forget as the affluent did, but cheaply, publicly, in the streets. We should remember this, in our reckoning of the craze, that the drinking was no monopoly of the poor, that the wealthy drank as deep in their private way, and that the particular horror at the gin was in part a horror at the poor, presuming to the same oblivion that the prosperous allowed themselves, the cheap public drunkenness of the dram-shop drawing the condemnation that the costly private drunkenness of the dining-room escaped. As we begin to draw toward the close of our long evening together, let us think for a while about what the gin craze left behind, what it gave to the ages that came after, for a thing so immense does not pass without leaving its mark, and the marks it left are with us still. It left, first, the great image, the artist's print of Gin Lane, fixed forever in the memory of the nation, the drunken mother, and the falling child and the collapsing street, the single picture through which all later ages would see the craze, the most enduring of all its legacies, the warning written in the lines of an engraving. It left the names, Madame Geneva and Mother's Ruin, the half-loved lady and the ruin of mothers, the words the drowning city gave to its cheap destroyer, carried down through the generations as a vocabulary of warning and rueful affection. It left a lesson in the governing of appetites, the hard-learned truth that prohibition fails against a thing the labouring poor genuinely want, that the forbidding only drives the trade into the dark and makes it worse, and that the taming and the regulating and the addressing of the deeper need are the surer way, a lesson written in the failure of 1736 and the success of 1751, and learned again and again by later ages in their own struggles. It left a memory of what the unbridled cheap spirit could do to a people, a warning that echoed through all the later struggles over drink, the temperance campaigns and the reform movements reaching back to the craze for their imagery and their arguments, the drowning city held up forever as the example of what drink could do. And it left, for those who would look beneath the warning to the human truth, a deeper lesson still, about poverty and the appetites it breeds, about what people will reach for when their lives are bitter enough and the escape is cheap enough, about the way the cheap destructive comfort flourishes in the soil of want and misery and loneliness. The truest legacy of the craze, for those who would learn it, was not the simple warning against the demon drink, but the deeper understanding that the drinking was the symptom and the poverty, the disease, that the townsfolk drowned in the gin because their lives were unbearable and the gin was cheap, and that the real remedy was never the law alone, but the bettering of the lives and the offering of better eases, the heat without the ruin. That deeper lesson the age learned only half, and later ages have learned and forgotten and learned again, the hard truth at the heart of the craze, that you cannot save people from their cheap destructive comforts without first easing the want that drives them to seek any consolation they can find. It is the hardest lesson of all, and the one most easily forgotten, for it asks more of a society than any law, asks it to look at the lives of its poorest, and to better them, which is slow and costly work, far harder than the passing of an act or the preaching of a sermon. The gin craze taught it, written in the drowning of the London poor, and the teaching is there still for any age that will read it. The hard truth that the cheap destructive comfort grows in the soil of want, and that the surest way to drain it is to ease the want itself. There is a question that hovers over the whole of this history, and we should face it gently before we end. The question of how we ought to feel about the people who drowned in the gin, whether we should look on them with pity or with judgment or with something kinder. And it matters how we answer it. It would be easy to judge them, the gin drinkers of the old streets, to see only the ruin and the neglect and the falling child, to condemn them as the moralists of their own age condemned them, the weak and the vicious brought low by their appetite for the cheap spirit. But that would be both unkind and untrue, a failure of understanding, for the population who drank the gin were not weak or vicious in some way that we are not, but poor and cold and tired beyond our understanding, reaching, as people in pain have always reached, for whatever ease was cheap enough to afford. We should look on them rather with sympathy, with the recognition that they were us in a harder time and with fewer reliefs, facing the same human needs and reaching for the same human ease. They wanted what we all want, warmth and rest and company, and a little forgetting at the end of a harsh day, and they found it where they could, in the cheap warm gin of the dram-shop, because their lives afforded them little else and the gin was the comfort within their reach. There but for the accident of our easier age go all of us, for who among us, set down in those cold crowded streets, but worn down by that hard labour and that constant want, with the warm cheap forgetting of the gin on every corner, can be sure they would have drunk less. And so the truest feeling to carry away from these streets is not judgment, but a kind of tenderness, a sympathy across the centuries for the common people who reached, as people always reach, for what comfort they could find in lives that were hard beyond our imagining. And they were not so different from us, the gin drinkers of the old streets, wanting only what we all want, the warmth and the ease and the brief forgetting, and finding it in the one cheap solace their brutal world afforded, and paying for it dearly. Let us remember them with tenderness, then, the lowest sort of the drowning parishes, not as the wicked or the weak, but as our own kind in a harder time, reaching for the glow and the comfort that all human creatures crave, in a world that gave them little else. And let our last feeling toward them be not the cold judgment of the moralist, but the warm sympathy of one human creature for another, across all the centuries that divide us. Let us spend a while with the magistrate at his bench, for it was there, in the daily procession of the accused, that the human wreckage of the gin came most starkly into view, and the men who sat in judgment saw the craze as few others did. The magistrate of the age was very often an ordinary gentleman of the district, appointed to keep the peace and administer the law, sitting in judgment upon the endless small crimes and disorders of his neighbourhood, and in the gin districts his bench was crowded with the casualties of the drink. Before him came the drunk and the disorderly taken up in the streets, the petty thieves who had stolen to feed their thirst, the brawlers and the vagrants and the destitute, the full sad procession of those whom the gin and the poverty together had brought to grief, and he dealt with them as the law and his own judgment directed, the prison and the fine and the whipping and the other rough justice of the age. Some of these magistrates were hard men, seeing only the crime and the disorder before them, and dealing with it harshly, blind to the deeper misery from which it sprang, dispensing the rough justice of the age without much thought for the conditions that had produced the wreckage before their bench. But some saw deeper, saw in the endless procession of the gin's casualties the working of a larger trouble, the poverty and the cheap spirit together grinding the people down, and these were the magistrates who became, some of them, the reformers, who took their knowledge of the craze from the bench and turned it into argument and evidence against the trade. The magistrates' bench was a window onto the craze like no other, the place where its human wreckage was gathered and displayed day after day, and the men who sat there, if they had eyes to see, learned the truth of the craze in the faces of those they judged. It was a grim seat, the magistrates' bench in the gin districts, for the procession of misery was endless, and the remedies the law allowed were harsh, and the deeper causes beyond any single man's power to touch, and the magistrate who cared, who saw the misery beneath the crime, could do little from his bench but dispense the rough justice of the age and grieve, perhaps, at the endless wreckage he could not stem. But from that hard seat came some of the clearest seeing of the whole craze, the magistrates who looked into the faces of the gin's casualties and understood, and carried that understanding into the long campaign that brought the trade at last under control. The bench was where the craze was judged, and it was also, for those who could see, where it was understood, the daily procession of misery, teaching the men who sat in judgment the hard truth of what the cheap gin was doing to the city's people, and turning some of them, in time, from judges of the wreckage into reformers of the trade that had produced it. Let us think of the street life that surrounded the dram-shops, the teeming world of the poor streets through which the gin trade ran, for the dram-shop did not stand alone, but in the midst of a crowded, clamorous street life that is part of the picture. The streets of the destitute parishes were an age of their own, crowded from morning to night, with the life of ordinary folk, the street sellers crying their wares, the costermongers with their barrows of fish and fruit and vegetables, the sellers of hot food and small eases, the hawkers of every cheap thing, the complete crowded commerce of the poor conducted in the open ways. There were the ballad sellers with their printed sheets, the showmen with their small entertainments, the beggars and the buskers and the tricksters, the full swarming street life of the great city's poor districts. Through this crowded life the children swarmed, the children of the poor who lived half their lives in the streets, playing in the filth of the unpaved ways, running errands and minding stalls and picking up what small coins they could, the street their playground and their school and their workplace all at once. There were the link boys who lit the way through the dark streets for those who could pay, carrying their flaming torches, and the crossing sweepers who cleared a path through the mud, and the multitude of children who lived by their wits in the streets, part of the crowded, teeming life that filled the needy parishes from morning to night. And through it all ran the gin, woven into the street life as into everything else, the dram-shops glowing on the corners, the sellers hawking their spirit through the crowds, the drink a constant presence in the teeming life of the streets. The street life and the gin were of a piece, the one the setting of the other, the crowded, clamorous world of the poor streets through which the gin trade ran and in which the gin was drunk. And to picture the craze rightly, you must picture not only the dram-shop, but the teeming street life around it, the sellers and the children, and the beggars and the buskers, the crowded commerce and the swarming life of the wretched parishes through which the gin flowed and in which the poor drank. It was a bitter world and a crowded one and a vivid one, the street life of the old parishes, full of want and life and noise and colour, and the gin was part of it, woven through the teeming fabric of the streets, one thread among many in the crowded, clamorous life of the London poor. The seasons turned over the gin districts as they turned over all the world, and the gin had its place in each of them, the drinking shifting with the turning year, and it is worth following the seasons through the old streets The winter was the hardest season, and the gin's great season, for the chill drove the people toward the warmth of the spirit and the warm-lit rooms, and the bitter months of the year saw the dram-shops at their busiest, the cold and the dark and the want of fuel sending the population in search of the cheap heat of the gin. To be poor in the London winter was to be cold to the bone, in rooms without enough fuel, in clothes worn thin, and the fierce comfort of the gin was the more precious for the bitterness of the season, the drink that warmed the frozen body and eased the misery of the dark winter months. The spring brought a little relief, the lengthening days and the softening weather easing the worst of the winter's grip. Though the spring had its own hardships, the hungry gap before the New Year's food came in, the agues and fevers of the turning season. The summer brought the warmth and the long light, and a different kind of drinking, the gin taken less against the chill now and more for its own sake, in the long warm evenings when men and women gathered in the streets and the dram-shops in the gentler weather. And the autumn brought the turning back toward the hard winter, the shortening days and the gathering chill sending the city's poor once more toward the warm-lit rooms and the consolation of the spirit. Through all the seasons the gin was there, its place shifting with the turning year, the huge winter comfort in the cold, the summer pleasure of the long warm evenings, the constant companion of the people through all the turning of the seasons. The year turned over the drowning parishes as it turned over all the world, the winters and the summers succeeding one another, and through them all the labouring poor drank their gin, against the winter chill and in the summer warmth, the cheap spirit woven into the turning of the seasons as into every other part of their lives. And there was something in the rhythm of it, the gin and the seasons turning together, the great winter drinking and the gentler summer drinking, the cheap relief following the labouring sort through all the turning year, that speaks of how deeply the spirit had woven itself into the very fabric of their lives, present in every season, the constant companion of the poor through all the turning of the year, in the cold and the warmth alike, the one cheap comfort that followed them through all the seasons of their hard lives. There is a question of liberty buried in the whole struggle over the gin, and it is worth drawing out, for the resistance to the laws against the spirit was, in part, a resistance in the name of freedom, and the people who fought to keep their gin were making, in their rough way, an argument about liberty. To working folk of the gin districts, the drinking of the spirit was their own affair, a matter of their own choice and their own lives, and the attempt of the distant Parliament to forbid it seemed to them an intrusion, a tyranny, the state reaching into the private lives of the common people to dictate what they might drink. The mock funerals and the hatred of the informers and the defiance of the law were all in part expressions of this feeling, the people insisting that their pleasures were their own and the law had no business forbidding them. And there were those above them too, who made the argument in more measured terms, who resisted the laws to check the gin not from any love of the spirit, but from a principled reluctance to have the state dictate the private habits of the city's people, a sense that the law should not reach so far into the private choices of free men. It was an argument that ran all through the age, this tension between the desire to suppress the harm of the gin and the reluctance to extend the power of the state over the private lives of the multitude, and it was never fully resolved, the same tension that runs through every later struggle over the governing of private pleasures and private vices. It is a tension we know still, the same argument in new forms, the perpetual question of how far the state may rightly reach into the private choices of the labouring sort, how far it may go in protecting them from their own appetites, where the line falls between the proper governing of harm and the improper tyranny over private life. The gin craze was one of the early grounds on which that vast argument was fought, the people insisting on their liberty to drink, and the reformers insisting on the duty of the state to protect them from the harm, and the long struggle between them was, among other things, a struggle over the limits of liberty and the reach of the state, a struggle that has never ended and never will, for it touches the deepest questions of how free people are to be governed. The people who fought to keep their gin were defending, in their rough way, a true principle, the liberty of the population to order their own lives and their own pleasures, and the reformers who fought to take it away were defending another, the duty of the society to protect its people from harm. And between those two principles, the liberty and the protection, the total long struggle over the gin, and over so much else, was fought. There is no final answer to it, that struggle, no settled line that all will agree to, for the two principles are both real and both good, and the balance between them must be struck and struck again in every age and over every new appetite. The liberty of the common throng weighed always against the harm, the freedom against the protection, in a contest that has no end because it touches the very nature of how free people are to live together. Let us think about what a penny meant in the world of the gin districts, for the cheapness of the gin was the whole engine of the craze. And to understand it, we must understand the money of the poor and what their few coins could buy. The poor of the age lived in a world of pennies and halfpennies and farthings, the small copper coins in which their entire economy was conducted, their wages reckoned in shillings and their daily spending in pennies, every coin precious, each farthing counted. A labourer might earn a few shillings in a day of harsh work, when work was to be had, and out of that few shillings must come the rent and the food and the fuel and the clothing for a complete family, a penny stretched to its utmost, the total hard arithmetic of survival conducted in the small copper coins. In such a world, the cheapness of the gin was its terrible power, for a penny that could buy so little else could buy a measure of the spirit, enough to bring a warmth and a forgetting that nothing else so cheap could give. A penny would not buy much bread, would not buy heat or shelter or any lasting comfort, but it would buy a dram of gin, and the gin gave, for that penny, an hour of ease that no other penny purchase could match, the warmth and the forgetting and the lifting of the misery, all for a single small coin. It was this, the unmatched value of the gin as a penny's worth of solace, that drew the poor so powerfully, for in the brutal economy of their lives the gin offered more ease for a penny than anything else within their reach. And there was the terrible spiral in it, for the penny spent on gin was a penny not spent on bread or fuel or rent, and the comfort of the dram was bought at the cost of the family's needs, the money that should have fed the children going instead for the spirit. The cheapness that made the gin so tempting made it so ruinous, for the pennies spent on the drink were pennies taken from the bare necessities of life, and the warm hour of forgetting was paid for in the hunger and the cold of the days that followed. The whole tragedy of the craze was written in the economy of the penny, the cheap drink that gave more ease for a coin than anything else could give, drawing the pennies from the bread and the fuel and the rent, the warm forgetting bought at the price of the family's needs, the terrible bargain of the dram that gave its hour of ease, and took in payment the bread from the table and the warmth from the hearth. And yet, knowing all this, the city's poor drank, not because they could not count the cost, but because the cost of not drinking, the unbroken weight of the cold and the hunger and the hopelessness, was itself too much to bear, and the dram's hour of ease was worth, to them, the hard price it exacted. That is the deepest cruelty of the penny economy of the gin, that the bargain was a real one, the comfort genuine, the need for it genuine, so that the people were not fools throwing away their bread for nothing but desperate creatures, buying the only ease they could afford at the only price they could pay, the glow of the dram against the cold of the days, and choosing, understandably, the warmth. We have walked a long way through the gin-soaked streets tonight, through the dram-shops and the courts, through the trade and the law, and the long history of it all. And now, as the evening draws toward its close, let us return one last time to the streets themselves, to feel them once more before we let them go. Picture the parish at evening as we first found it, the narrow ways and the leaning houses, the coal smoke hanging low over the rooftops, the warm yellow glow of the dram-shops spilling out into the gathering dark. Picture the labouring poor moving through the streets, the labourers and the washerwomen and the porters coming home from their hard day, the cold and the weariness on them, drawn toward the warm-lit rooms and the cheap consolation of the gin. Picture them stepping in from the bitter street into that low, bright room, the door swinging to behind them, the noise and the press and the heat of it closing round them, the cheap spirit passing across the rough counter and the misery of the day loosening its grip a little as they drink. It was a grim world and a ruinous comfort they reached for, and it did them harm, and yet we have learned, across all our walking tonight, to hold the harm and the relief together, to see the ruin without losing sight of the human need beneath it, and to understand the townsfolk of these parishes as neither saints nor sinners but only ourselves in a harder time. The history is told now, the long account of it given, and the streets fall silent in our imagining as the people drift away toward their rest. Let the streets grow quiet now, and let the population find their rest, the cold and weary poor of the old parishes settling at last into their crowded rooms, the dram-shops shutting one by one, the warm lights going dim, the great clamorous city sinking toward its sleep. We have walked their streets and learned their trade and understood their drinking, and now we may let them go with tenderness into the quiet of the night and the longer still of the centuries, the common people of the drowning parishes, reaching for their warmth and their comfort in their hard freezing age, and finding it for an hour in the glowing dram-shops of the old streets before the long sleep took them all. If wandering through these vanished places is something you have found you would like to do again, you are always welcome to subscribe, and to keep me company the next time we step together into some lost corner of the past. There is no hurry about any of it. There will be another evening and another world to walk through together, and I would be glad of your company when it comes, the next time we push open a door into the past and step inside, into some other vanished place, to learn it and feel it and understand it, as we have learned and felt and understood the gin-soaked streets of old London tonight. But for tonight, that is enough. The lights of the old dram-shops are burning low, the streets are emptying, the great city is sinking toward its sleep, and the long evening in the world of the gin craze draws gently to its close. Let it go now, and let your mind grow quiet, and let yourself drift down towards sleep, carried by the soft, warm memory of those old streets, and all the cold and hopeful and entirely human people who once reached, in the warm-lit dram-shops of the drowning parishes, for the cheap comfort that was the only mercy their hard place afforded. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house. And I will see you in the next one. Good night.